Do you know Mr. and Mrs. Astor?
Good evening, madam.
Oh, and a touch of glamour at your table. You'll have heard of Miss Dorothy Gibson.
Oh, I doubt it. Why should folks like you care about my crazy job? And this is my mother.
Hello.
Miss Gibson, the film star.
And Miss...
Imagine hearing the cries and screams of horror from people who you know will surely sink to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean as you sit safely in a lifeboat. Now imagine being in that lifeboat with death all around you and having one concern on your mind, and it is, I'll never be able to wear all of my new clothes from Paris. They sank with the Titanic. If you were Dorothy Gibson, you wouldn't have to imagine it. That's one of the many selfish thoughts that went through her head and even came out of her mouth as 1,500 people were in the midst of losing their lives while she made her way safely onto a lifeboat that was never even loaded to full capacity. In our modern times, many of us can't help but to think of James Cameron's Titanic film when we think of the actual 1912 sinking. Its big names and big budget special effects and set certainly made it a spectacle for the eye to remember. Yet, Titanic historians, and survivors when they were alive, preferred the 1958 film called A Night to Remember for its historical authenticity. It is often called the first Titanic movie, but it's not. The first Titanic movie was called Saved from the Titanic, and it was released in May of 1912, just 4 weeks after the disaster occurred. And its star was our Dorothy Gibson, the girl who was so sad about losing her brand new Parisian fashions in the wee morning hours of April 15th, 1912. She was a silent film actress, and this role was going to make her a bigger star than she already was. And the movie was made by her lover, a man who was married to another woman. But you know how the saying goes, whatever is done in the dark will come to the light. And the way that this adulterous affair came to be known by the public was a scandal in and of itself. Dorothy's story has it all. Sexual affairs, crazy court cases, a man in a nightgown, a homicide, and a stay in a Nazi concentration camp. This is the story of one of the most self-absorbed first-class passengers who boarded the Titanic. Silent film actress Dorothy Gibson. She was a total hot mess. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up to support this video. For free. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. Dorothy Gibson was born Dorothy Winifred Brown on May 17, 1889 in Hoboken, New Jersey. Her father was John A. Brown. He died when she was only 3 years old. Her mother was Pauline Caroline Boson, and she remained in Dorothy's life until she died. Until Dorothy died, that is. Dorothy's mother, Pauline, ended up outliving Dorothy. Her mother didn't waste any time when it came to marrying again. Pauline was always looking for a way to climb up, so any old man just wouldn't do. When she caught the attention of an affluent merchant named John Leonard Gibson, she knew that he was the one. She married him before Dorothy turned 5, and it was through this marriage that Dorothy received the surname Gibson, the name that she would use in her stage and film career that made her a household name in America, Dorothy Gibson. John Gibson, though he had a large amount of money, was a sensible man and didn't feel the need to spend a lot or show off what he had. Pauline was the opposite, and she reared Dorothy to be the same as she, frivolous when it came to spending money and having an appetite for the finer things in life. This created a divided household, John standing alone against mother and daughter. Pauline was rearing Dorothy to be a bit of a spoiled brat. Here's how Dorothy described their relationship dynamic after she became famous. Quote, "My father is a great man of the spirit and is contented with the simple life. But I and my mother are bohemian, and we find the pleasures of this lovely world irresistible." End quote. So let's talk about her path to fame. In 1906, the Gibson family moved from New Jersey to Manhattan, where Dorothy was introduced to the theater, and she became obsessed. She wanted to be on stage too. And what Dorothy wanted, Pauline saw to it that Dorothy got. By the time Dorothy was 17, her mother had her on stage, dancing, acting, and singing in vaudeville productions. It is impossible to tell Dorothy's story without frequently mentioning her mother, Pauline. Pauline was a stage mother of the worst kind. As a very young girl, men took notice of Dorothy's good looks, and her mother didn't mind pimping out her daughter if it was to her own advantage. So Pauline managed Dorothy's career. Under Pauline's management, Dorothy became a regular chorus girl at the Hippodrome Theater. And Dorothy also made it to Broadway to perform in a musical called The Dairymaids. That was considered to be a pivotal moment in her career. After the musical, she started getting noticed for bigger opportunities. In 1909, a famous commercial artist wanted to work with Dorothy. His name was Harrison Fisher, and I want to give you a little background information on him. Chances are that if you're interested in this side of history, you're already familiar with Charles Dana Gibson. He was a commercial artist who got his start in the 1880s. He became famous for drawing The Gibson Girl, an iconic illustration that was said to have portrayed American beauty at its best. His Gibson Girl images were everywhere, and Charles Gibson worked for decades in his field. As Gibson's fame was dying out, Harrison Fisher was just getting started, and he had a new ideal in mind for the American beauty standard, and it was Dorothy Gibson. After seeing her perform at the Hippodrome Theater, he went backstage to meet her and asked her if she would sit as a model for him. She was beyond flattered at the notion, so of course she accepted. And their collaboration made her more famous than she had ever dreamed she could be. Charles Dana's Gibson Girl was a thing of the past. The new thing now was the Harrison Fisher Girl. And that's what they called Dorothy, the original Harrison Fisher Girl. And I think that it's such a quirky coincidence that the Gibson Girl was replaced by a girl whose name actually was Gibson, but she became known as the Fisher Girl. Now, because of Fisher, Dorothy Gibson was booking modeling gigs. She would sit for his drawing sessions, and he used her face on product labels, in book illustrations, on postcards, and she was even on the cover of women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Cosmopolitan. Her face was everywhere, and she was legitimately famous. And she didn't understand why. Dorothy knew that she was pretty, but she had seen Fisher's other models and thought that they were prettier than she. Here's how she described her confusion about becoming his most famous model. Quote, "I was fortunate to be discovered, in a manner of speaking, by Mr. Fisher, but he had many models, and some of them were far prettier than I was. I do not know what he saw in me." End quote. Well, I think that's just the thing. Fisher wasn't exactly drawing Dorothy. Here's what I mean. Dorothy was his palette or starting template, but he wouldn't draw her exactly as he saw her or exactly the way she looked. This sounds creepy to me, but he would draw Dorothy in a way that made her look both younger and more sexualized at the same time. Like if he were around today, authorities might be interested in seeing just what he was looking at online, if you catch my drift. To accomplish the sultry and childlike look he was going for, he would soften the shape of her nose, extend the space between her eyes, and slightly lift her jaw. The June 1911 edition of Cosmopolitan displays this style and is analyzed by Andrew Wilson in Shadow of the Titanic, who points out that Dorothy is drawn, quote, drinking sarsaparilla from a tall glass, her long fingers caressing its base, the lips of her rosebud mouth closed around the straw. Dorothy's mix of ingenue innocence and barely concealed sexual energy was a winning combination for the illustrator, end quote. By the way, while Dorothy's star was rising as a model, she got married to George Henry Battier Jr., a young pharmacist who was near her age. He exists as a mere footnote in the story of her life, and their marriage didn't last long. We'll get there. After making her mark on the stage and in the world of commercial modeling, Dorothy looked on to the next venture. And it was film. The movie industry was still in its very early stages in the 1910s. And in 1911, Dorothy entered the industry as an extra, getting in on the ground floor. Before the year was over, she had been hired as a leading lady for the U.S. branch of Éclair Studios, a Paris-based movie studio. Their American operations were in New Jersey. And in that same year, Éclair debuted its first film. It was an historical drama called Hands Across the Sea. Dorothy played the role of Molly Pitcher, and the debut was a success. But later that year, the studio would find Dorothy's real strength, and it wasn't in playing a serious, dramatic character. Dorothy shined in comedy. Miss Masquerader was Dorothy's next role, and it was a hit for her and the studio. She received positive reviews for her acting, with critics writing that she had a natural talent for pulling off comedy in film. Dorothy's fame had certainly reached new heights after her Miss Masquerader film was released. But after surviving the Titanic disaster, her most famous role ever would come about as a direct result of having traveled on the doomed liner. The film was called Saved from the Titanic, and it was based on her own experience. Loosely, very loosely. So how did Dorothy Gibson even wind up on the Titanic in the first place? It was actually she and her mother. They had been enjoying a European vacation that was supposed to have lasted for 3 months. It got cut short when Dorothy received a call from her studio telling her that she needed to return home to start filming a new series of movies. When she learned that the Titanic was the first ship headed back home, she booked first-class tickets for her mother and herself to get on it. Pretty straightforward. But why was she in Europe? Yeah, sure, she was on vacation, and everybody needs a break from time to time. But there was another reason that Dorothy had taken this vacation, and it wasn't innocent at all. Jules Brulatour was a producer at Éclair Studios and one of the most powerful men in the budding film industry. He was Dorothy's boss, and he provided the financial backing for a number of her films. He was also Dorothy's lover. The main problem with this was that he was a married man, and he didn't mind hiding money from his wife and using it to shower Dorothy with expensive presents. He was interested in Dorothy from the moment he met her at a film industry gala in 1911. He told her that night that he felt like he already knew her because he had seen her lovely photos in all of the newspapers. Dorothy's mother, Pauline, loved the attention and the money and the material things that Dorothy and she got as a result of this illicit affair, so she pushed for it to continue. Pauline didn't want to miss out on anything that she could get from her daughter opening her legs to this married man. But you know how these things usually go. The married man enters the affair wanting sex. The woman enters wanting marriage. That was the case with this affair. Dorothy wanted marriage, and so did her mother. Pauline's thought was, if he's doing all this for you as a mistress, just think of what we can get if he marries you. Mind you, at this time, Dorothy was earning $175 per week. Adjusted for inflation, that's a little over $12,000 per week in today's 2024 money. So Dorothy was not hurting financially in any way. But enough was a word that wasn't in her mother's vocabulary. Pauline knew that Dorothy could get a lot more money if she could marry Jules and have access to his fortune. For months, she had already been arranging the meetings for Dorothy to have sex with Jules. During the daytime, they were at the studio. He was Mr. Brulatour, and she was Dorothy. But at nighttime, they were at the St. Regis Hotel, and he was her Julie, and she was his Mutsy. Lovey-dovey nicknames. How stupid. So Pauline just came up with one more scheme to get this pair of lovers together forever. In a nutshell, the plan was to make Jules miss Dorothy so much that he would realize that he wanted to marry her. Pauline told Dorothy to ask for some time off so that she could take a vacation to Europe. She was given the time off. Then Dorothy and Pauline made their way to Europe. They had a 3-month itinerary that included several stops in European countries and North Africa. They set sail on March 17, 1912. The whole time they were gone, Pauline was coaching Dorothy on what to say in telegram messages to Jules that were sent to his office at the studio. Tell him that you bought a sexy dress in Monaco and you can't wait for him to see you in it. Tell him you bought some naughty lingerie in Paris and you can't wait to wear it for him. Tell him all the things that you want to do for him in the bedroom. We're all adults here. We know that she wasn't talking about folding his laundry in the bedroom. It all sounds so straightforward. Too straightforward and way too aggressive for a woman, especially in that era. But guess what? It worked. Dorothy's absence, coupled with her sexy messages, had her on Jules' mind day and night. And he was ready to leave his wife to marry Dorothy. On April 8th, Dorothy received a telegram at her hotel in Genoa. It was from her studio, telling her that she needed to return home ASAP. Not because Jules was ready to marry her. That would come later. This telegram was about business. It was time to film a new series of silent films, and they needed her at work. So it was settled, and Dorothy and Pauline would be on their way back to America only 3 weeks into their 3-month trip. Dorothy made a quick stop in France, and she was able to book a ticket on some ship called the Titanic. That's all that she knew about it. It was her quickest way to get home. Dorothy had no idea that 2 days after getting that telegram, that she and her mother would soon be aboard the largest and most luxurious vessel that had ever sailed. On April 10th, they were on the Titanic. And just like every other passenger on that liner, Dorothy and Pauline were having a grand old time until trouble struck on April 14th at 11:40 p.m. Thankfully, because Dorothy was so famous and a lot of people wanted to hear what she had to say about her time on Titanic, we have a lot of information about what happened to her. So let me tell you about Dorothy's last night on the Ship of Dreams. Dorothy and Pauline were in the saloon on Deck A, playing bridge with a couple of friends they'd made from first class. 2 men, Frederick Seward, a marine lawyer, and William Sloper, a stockbroker. As Dorothy remembered it, there was, quote, a great deal of merriment on board, end quote. Then they felt something, a slight jar, as she put it. But of course, they didn't stop the game. There was nothing to worry about. They were on an unsinkable ship. Well, every ship is unsinkable until it sinks. And before Dorothy's card game was over, it became clear the Titanic was going down. According to Dorothy, after feeling that movement, she and the other bridge players carried on playing and laughing for another 15 minutes before she realized that something was amiss. When she looked up from her card hand, she finally noticed the ship's stewards and officers. As she retold the story, they were moving with considerable nervousness. But then, still nothing was registering that serious danger was just minutes away. Dorothy said goodnight to her table and went outside for a walk on the deck. And that's when she saw that Titanic was listing. As she put it, the great ship was leaning heavily on one side. Then she noticed that other passengers didn't notice. She stepped back into the saloon to find everyone having a blast, enjoying that beautiful night, playing cards, talking, laughing, and drinking. Then finally, the group of card players learned that what they felt earlier was the ship colliding with an iceberg, and now it was time to get to safety. And they all did so with relative ease, including the men in her party. At 12:45 a.m., an hour and 5 minutes after the collision, the first distress signal rocket was fired. Anyone who hadn't got the message likely understood by this point the time for fun and games was over. Officers on the starboard side of the ship were ready to launch the first lifeboat. Now, there was a commotion and panic filled the air. Dorothy and Pauline weren't even in control of the directions their bodies were going, as a crowd surge came about and people were just leaning into each other, trying their best to get off the boat that just days before, almost everybody in the world wanted to get on. Somehow, Dorothy and her mother managed to hold on to each other and not get disconnected. And Dorothy didn't mind being pushed around the way that she was, because she could see that she was being pushed in the direction of where the lifeboats were to be lowered. Frederick and William helped Dorothy and Pauline into a lifeboat. Then, as gentlemen would have been expected to do, they turned away to make a path for more women and potentially children to enter the lifeboat. Well, Dorothy grabbed William's hand and refused to let go. She insisted to the officer in charge that he allow her two male friends to get into the lifeboat. The one thing that there wasn't time for was an argument, so the officer let the two men get in with Dorothy so that he could get about the business of trying to save some more lives. They were joined by the Bishops, a couple from Detroit who were on their honeymoon. Yes, most of us are familiar with the phrase, women and children first, in reference to the loading of the lifeboats in this tragedy, but that's what it was. Women and children first, not women and children only. Dorothy and her fellow passengers were in lifeboat number 7, the first lifeboat that was launched. It was lowered into the water and made its escape from the calamity. I won't say that it was the first lifeboat that was filled, because it wasn't full. It sailed away from the Titanic with only 28 people in it, 25 first-class passengers, and 3 Titanic crew members. Now, brace yourself. The lifeboat had a capacity to hold 65. Here's a quick side note that I thought you might like. This lifeboat, number 7, almost carried 2 pregnant teen wives. The lady in the honeymooning couple from Michigan was 19 years old and had conceived on her honeymoon. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the Titanic, tried to get his 18-year-old pregnant wife in this lifeboat too, Madeline Astor, but she was too afraid to try to get in and decided to stay on Titanic with her husband until much later. And since I've given you one side note, allow me to give you another one. Guess who helped Dorothy and her mother and dozens of passengers into the lifeboats on the starboard side of Titanic? He is the man who walked away from this catastrophe with the reputation for being the biggest coward on board, Bruce Ismay. In real life, and in James Cameron's Titanic, he is the man who was depicted as sneaking into a lifeboat, then lowering his head in shame as his lifeboat was lowered into the water. But back to Dorothy and lifeboat number 7. Knowing that the ocean liner only had enough lifeboats for roughly a third of its passengers to begin with, makes this number of 28 passengers in lifeboat number 7 seem all the more disgusting. Everyone in number 7 was rescued, but not without a hiccup or two. A problem arose while the 28 were getting loaded in. The drainage plug in the bottom of the boat somehow got displaced. As Dorothy recalled, women aboard offered up their lingerie items, and men offered up some of their clothing items to stuff in the hole. Obviously, these various pieces of cloth didn't provide a tight seal, so icy water started seeping into the bottom of the boat, but just a tiny bit at a time. Still, it was enough to completely cover their feet for the next few hours. As someone who absolutely hates being in cold temperatures, I can only imagine how dreadful those few hours were for them, but I'm sure that they were able to look just as far as their eyes could see and realize that they were still in an enviable position. Yes, their feet were cold, bone-chillingly cold, but hundreds of people around them were freezing to death and drowning. As Dorothy put it, quote, "I never knew one could be so cold and live. I ached from head to foot, and I was much more warmly clad than some of the women." End quote. Dorothy was wearing an evening dress that night. She had a sweater and a short overcoat on top of her dress. And when she said that she had on more clothes than other women, that wasn't a judgment call suggesting that the other women were dressed inappropriately. No, many of the other women were dressed for bed on a ship that wasn't supposed to sink. Many of these women were in bed for the night before the ship hit the iceberg. And even when they stepped out of their cabins to learn about the commotion that was going on around them, a lot of them just went back to their beds for the night, thinking, "Oh, the crew will fix it." So by the time it became clear to everyone that there was a serious emergency underway, it was too late for those women to put on warm clothes. They had one job only, and it was to get off of the Titanic alive. Right around 2 o'clock in the morning, it finally became obvious to lifeboat number 7 passengers that most of Titanic's passengers were not going to escape from the ship. George Hogg, one of the crew members on number 7, ordered that their lifeboat be rowed away from Titanic because the risk of being sucked down with it was high. So those 3 crew members and passengers did as he said and rowed away from Titanic as hard and quickly as they could. Dorothy's eyes were focused on Titanic, which at this point was partially underwater with its stern up in the air before its final plunge. This is what Dorothy said happened next. Quote, "Suddenly, there was a wild coming together of voices from the ship, and we noticed an unusual commotion among the people about the railing. Then the awful thing happened, the thing that will remain in my memory until the day I die." End quote. Dorothy was able to get in the first lifeboat that launched. That means that she had a shorter time to panic about getting to safety than most of the people on the ship. And of course, we know that many who were panicking never made it to safety. But even in that short time that Dorothy had to wait for her half-empty lifeboat to drift her out of harm's way, she still found time to think one selfish thought. As her fellow passengers were scrambling on the decks, looking for loved ones, looking for life jackets, trying to find their way into lifeboats, Dorothy's thought was this, and she said it: "I'll never get to ride in that gray car again." Now, when I first read this, I thought that perhaps Dorothy was disoriented and having some type of mental breakdown. But no, she knew exactly what she was saying. She was talking about the gray Detroit automobile made by Chalmers that her boyfriend had bought for her. It was a fancy car that she loved to drive. And as the Titanic was starting to sink, that's where Dorothy's mind went. Woe is me, I'll never get to drive my favorite car again. But we know that she would get to drive her favorite car again. Dorothy and her fellow passengers in lifeboat number 7 spent a long, dark, cold morning in the Atlantic before they were rescued. There was talk amongst them about how horrifying the screams were of the people who had not been so fortunate to find their way into lifeboats. That led to another conversation that was quickly shut down. "Hey, our lifeboat isn't full. Let's go back and get some more passengers." That was the sentiment of one of the crew members. Well, he was outnumbered 27-1. "We can't go back. What if our boat gets pulled under? What if too many people try to get on our boat? They'll all be fine. They can get on their own lifeboats." The crew member then informed the 25 passengers that he knew for a fact that there weren't enough lifeboats for every passenger who had booked a ticket, and some of them would surely sink with the ship or freeze in the ocean. That didn't change anyone's mind. They sat there in lifeboat number 7 and listened to the screams and cries until they stopped. The survivors on lifeboat number 7 were slightly inconvenienced when some of the icy water started to enter their little craft, but they managed. The coldness in the air was nearly unbearable, especially for the women who had just hours before been perfectly comfortable in their dresses and nightgowns. At some point, after most of the passengers who were floating in the water were surely dead, another dreadful thought entered Dorothy's mind. All of those beautiful pieces that she'd bought in Europe for her lover to see. The clothes that were going to make Jules leave his wife for her. They were at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Oh no, my beautiful new dresses and lingerie. I'm not joking. These are words that she shared about her Titanic experience. The passengers on lifeboat number 7 then listened as hundreds of people were submerged into their icy grave. Dorothy said that it was a mixture of yells, shrieks, and moans. And then, under the water, they could hear and feel explosions. These were most likely from the stern imploding as it sank. It had to have been horrifying for everyone. But after all of the talk about all of the cries and moans of the people who weren't able to get into a lifeboat, one could only wonder how sorry Dorothy and the other 27 people in lifeboat number 7 truly were. Did they feel badly enough to do something? To help? Well, listen to this. The crew member who told them to row away from Titanic so that they wouldn't go under with her was the lookout, George Hogg. And after the unsinkable sank, he was the one who wanted to turn lifeboat number 7 around, have the passengers row back to the spot of the sinking to pick up some more survivors. He knew, as anyone should have known, that they wouldn't last long in the icy waters. But when he told the passengers of lifeboat number 7 his suggestion to go back and pick up people who were surely freezing to death, every single person in number 7 objected, Dorothy included. Now you tell me, how badly did she really feel? How badly did they really feel? I'm sorry, but there is just no good excuse for this. Every lifeboat should have been filled to capacity. When Dorothy was asked why her lifeboat didn't turn around to pick up passengers, she couldn't quite find the words to explain that to the press. I bet she couldn't. Less than a week after the tragedy, Dorothy's account was published and it was full of contradictions. First, she said that after Titanic disappeared, she could see bobbing heads all around in the water. Then later, she says in that same time frame that no one could be seen in the water. Even if a bit of sense could have been made out of her timeline, it displayed a window of opportunity to save some more lives. I'm telling you, she knew what she and her first-class ticket-holding cohorts had done was wrong and unjustifiable. And I want to make it very clear that Dorothy was not the only one or even the main one to blame. She just so happens to be our subject today, so my focus is on her. I'm looking forward to telling you the stories of everyone in lifeboat number 7 and as many Titanic passengers as I can, if you'll allow me to. But it's Dorothy's turn today. These post-Titanic interviews in which she told half-truths, lies, and contradictions laid the groundwork for the script that she would write for her Titanic movie, If she had told the American public the truth about how she and her fellow survivors conducted themselves, she would surely lose her status as America's sweetheart. Lifeboat number 7, having only 28 passengers in it, isn't even half of the story. Oh no, this is like an awful infomercial, because wait, there's more. Herbert Pittman was the Titanic crew member in charge of lifeboat number 5. While drifting in the early morning, he saw Dorothy's lifeboat and called out to its passengers. When he got close enough to see that lifeboat number 7 only had 28 passengers, he felt like his own lifeboat was crowded. It held 40. All of the lifeboats were designed to hold 65. When Pittman got close enough, he put some of the survivors from his lifeboat onto Dorothy's. Then crew members tied both of the lifeboats together. Why? So that they could go back together and scoop up as many survivors as possible? Hell no, don't be silly. They tied their two boats together so that they would be more visible to their rescue vessel. Combined, they had enough space to save 62 more people from freezing to death, but instead, they only looked out for the ones who were already safe. This time, no one even suggested going to rescue more people. And this was about the time that Dorothy started to feel sad. For herself. Here's how Titanic researcher Andrew Wilson wrote about it. Quote, "In that freezing, uncomfortable boat, she began to feel sorry for herself. She remembered some of the clothes she had bought in Paris just before she had traveled to Cherbourg, garments she had chosen to captivate and titillate her older lover. There was the beautiful afternoon dress, the color of champagne, the pink blouse, a vision of lace and chiffon. And then there were those silk stockings and risque lingerie sets she had packed away in her trunks, all of which now lay at the bottom of the ocean." End quote. Then she thought of Jules, of course, and how much she loved that married man. There were their messages back and forth to each other. "Will do everything, make you completely happy. Love you madly, Julie." Remember, we're talking about telegrams here, so all of the words weren't always included. Another one of his telegrams. "It caused no happiness without Mutsy. Never allow you leave again, Julie." To which she replied, "Hardly wait get back. Cable made me awfully happy. Mutsy." Yeah, sure, she'd be happy to get back to see him, but it just wouldn't be the same without her brand new clothes. But oh yeah, people were dead and still dying. Dorothy actually had a discussion on the lifeboat with her friend from the bridge game, William, about all of the people who had died. But Dorothy, refusing to look guilty about it, in front of a man who was right there with her and just as guilty as she, continued to say whatever she could to help them all feel better about looking at themselves in the mirror. She told William that hardly any people would be dead because surely most of the passengers got away in lifeboats. We all know that that wasn't true. Chances are Dorothy also knew that was a lie when she said it. But one of the Titanic crew members quickly put that lie to rest when he interjected and said, even if all of the lifeboats were filled, not more than a third on Titanic could have escaped. That reality brought lifeboats number 5 and number 7 to silence. There was coldness, death, and stillness in the atmosphere for the next few hours. Then roughly at 6 a.m., the RMS Carpathia arrived to rescue those who had survived through the wee hours of the morning. Lifeboat number 7 was the third to have its passengers loaded onto Carpathia. Dorothy met a kind couple who offered her space in their cabin, which she gladly accepted. After eating breakfast, she retired to their room and slept for 26 hours straight. After waking up, the first thing on her mind was her man. Not her husband. She was still married to what's-his-name, but I'm talking about Jules. She wanted to send him a telegram, but she had a long wait. You can imagine how many people were trying to get messages home. Well, on April 17th, she got a telegram from him that read, "Will be worried to death till I hear from you. What awful agony. Julie." Having nothing except the clothes on her back, she had to borrow money to send him a short reply. In case you didn't know, people were charged per each letter or character when they sent telegrams. So she kept her reply short and sweet, and professional, since it was going to his home, where his wife could easily intercept it. It simply read, "Safe, picked up by Carpathia. Don't worry, Dorothy." Then finally, the next day, actually the next night, on April 18th, the Carpathia arrived in New York, delayed due to bad weather. It was 9:25 p.m. and very dark outside, but that did not stop the Titanic Welcome Committee from waiting to see their loved ones get off of their rescue vessel. And Jules Brulatour, being the shrewd businessman he was, didn't miss out on an opportunity to capitalize even on this moment. He made sure to have his movie camera rolling for the triumphant return of his mistress. Within the next few days, he had the reel spinning in theaters across the country, and he was making a lot of money because of it. This let him know that he was on to something when it came to the other idea that had been in the back of his mind since he heard about the Titanic going down. A movie about the Titanic disaster, starring his mistress. That was just what the people would want to see. There is this perception that people who lived during the Edwardian period or the Gilded Age, whatever you call it on your side of the globe, lived a much more wholesome way than we do today. And I'm here to tell you that that is simply not true. They just didn't have reality TV and Jerry Springer back then. No spaces existed where they could flaunt the worst of their behaviors. But despite their classy suits and elegant dresses, they too lived scandalous lives. And the general public back then had an appetite for scandal, just as we do today. And Jules knew that he could make another small fortune by filling their movie screens with a bit of human exploitation. He would run the idea by Dorothy as soon as he got a chance to have a quiet moment with her. When Dorothy and Pauline disembarked, there were a lot of loved ones and press members waiting to see them. Dorothy was interviewed by several reporters. She told one, quote, "The concerted cry of despair that came from the direction of the liner as she plunged into the ocean is ringing in my ear this minute. I cannot describe it. It sounded like a mighty wail." End quote. Waiting for Dorothy and Pauline were Dorothy's stepfather, her aunt, who was her mother's sister, and even some friends from their neighborhood in New Jersey. Leonard Gibson, Pauline's husband and Dorothy's stepfather, greeted the ladies with a big hug, then whisked the entire party off to a celebratory dinner that lasted until early the next morning. The whole time she was thinking about Jules. She wanted to get away from her family and friends so that she could see her lover. And she did. She took a taxi to her apartment. I don't know how she got inside. I suspect that she didn't have her keys. At any rate, she tidied herself up and then went to a hotel to meet Jules. And she was finally in her gray car that she had been daydreaming about on the Titanic. Again, I don't know how she had the key. Maybe the car key was already in her apartment. Car keys were just becoming a thing in 1910, and I have a feeling that this would have been a newer car, but who knows? Maybe it didn't need a key. Please forgive the tangent, but my mind really did wonder about how she was able to get back into her apartment and car after midnight. Well, Jules was excited to see Dorothy. And guess what? He had a proposal waiting for her that night. A new film project proposal. "Dorothy, you should have seen how crazy things were here. We had Titanic fever in America. Everybody would want to see your survival story. It would make you crazy famous. What do you say, Mutsy?" She said yes. I tell you, that Jules wasn't one of the leading men in his industry for no reason. But he had another proposal for Dorothy that night. This one came with a $1,000 diamond cluster ring. "Will you marry me, even though I'm still married with 3 children and not even close to getting a legal separation?" She said yes. Sure, a lot of people were sad because they'd lost loved ones who they'd never see again, but Titanic was a win-win situation for Dorothy. Getting on that boat won her the movie role of a lifetime and the man of her dreams. Her thoughts? It really does suck for you all, but everything is going my way, so you should all just be happy about that and come see my new movie. You know that this isn't going to end well for her, right? The conversation that Dorothy had with William before they were rescued by Carpathia brings us back to her post-Titanic interviews. Dorothy told the press that she behaved as a lady should have. She was offered a seat on a lifeboat, and she took it. End of story, period. Well, William Sloper, her bridge-playing friend, said, but, that was not the end of the story. He liked Dorothy, and to some degree could say that she saved his life. But he told the media what Dorothy said on Titanic as people started shuffling around to get on lifeboats. He said Dorothy, quote, kept repeating over and over so that people standing near us could hear her, "I'll never ride in my little gray car again," end quote. William let the people know that America's sweetheart was obsessed with her material items while people were trying to save their lives. Why did he feel the need to share this? It may have been because his name was getting dragged in the mud over an embarrassing lie, and he didn't want to go down alone, so he decided to take down his card-playing friend with him. You might want to know what was said about William. Well, I found this article from the April 19th Buffalo Courier, from just days after the disaster. It says that William Sloper was rescued from Titanic because he was mistaken for a woman, because he was wearing a woman's nightgown. Now, this was not true at all, but I can imagine that William was pretty upset about it. The thought is that this story was printed about William because he didn't want to talk to reporters after the sinking. He wouldn't give anyone an interview, so they just started making up stuff about him. Well, their plan worked. It got him to talk. Then eventually, he cleared his name and left a stain on Dorothy's that no one denied. But Dorothy didn't have time to worry about her lies being exposed in newspapers. She had a movie to make. The movies that Dorothy was originally returning to film got put on the back burner. She and Jules got straight to work on this Titanic project. Saved from the Titanic. Very clever name, I know. Dorothy came up with the storyline. Jules secured the filming location and even came up with the bright idea to have her wear the same clothing she had worn that night and early morning on the ill-fated ship. For authenticity. Dorothy was so excited to work on this production. We can't know for certain what was truly motivating her. Was it that she trusted Jules when he said that this movie was going to make her more famous than she already was? Or was it something less self-serving? Was this movie a vehicle for her to deal with her trauma? Was she just excited about the big payday that she knew was coming? Maybe it was a little bit of all of that. The story that she wrote for herself allowed her to be a better version of Dorothy than the real Dorothy. In her movie, her character's name was Dorothy. Dorothy was coming back home on the Titanic to reunite with her boyfriend, Jack. Jack was in the Navy, and he wasn't married. And in her movie version, the part about how Dorothy and the other passengers in lifeboat number 7 colluded to not rescue Titanic passengers who were freezing to death was left out of the script completely. That might have been bad for the real Dorothy's image. Dorothy and Jules made the first exploitation film. It was released on May 16th, 1912, just 1 month after the sinking, and it performed very well in box offices in the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. Dorothy was on top of the world and everything was going her way against all odds. She made it off of the Titanic alive and could tell her story. Not only was she telling it, she was getting paid a heck of a lot to do so. She had a successful movie running, she was the highest paid movie actress in the world, and she had the man she wanted getting ready to leave his wife any moment now so that he could marry her. Life was great. What was next? Retirement. After a film career that didn't even last 2 years, Dorothy retired at the top of her game. Some who have researched her extensively came to the conclusion that facing the fake Dorothy on the movie screen while knowing the truth about herself was just too much for her to handle, and that's why she walked away from the movie industry. But she still wanted fame. Her next move was to pursue a singing career. Jules was going to use his connections to make Dorothy an opera star. There was only one small problem with this. She couldn't really sing that well. But she did make it to the Metropolitan Opera House for one show run. There were no surprises there. Even Dorothy herself never said she had a pretty voice. She described her own voice as uncommon, which leads me to believe that Dorothy got a lot of requests to sing solo. Solo that no one can hear, please ma'am. With her singing career over as soon as it started, Dorothy was ready to move on to the next phase of her life. She wanted a husband. No, not her own husband. She wanted Clara Brulatour's husband, Jules. Quick side note, because we are a caring audience, I know that you care as much about Dorothy's clothing items that she lost on the Titanic just as much as she did. So I want to let you know that eventually she was compensated for what she lost. She and her mother received a $4,000 check from White Star Line, the owner of Titanic, in January of 1913. Meanwhile, Jules was doing everything that he could do to please his little Dorothy. I should mention that he was roughly twice her age. She was 22 when she boarded the Titanic and Jules was 42, with an age-appropriate wife. But he was doing his best to get rid of that old hag, and Dorothy was doing her best to be patient about it. Jules tried to make her wait as pleasant as he could. He gave Dorothy unlimited use of his Long Island house while she waited out his marriage. He also sent Dorothy and her mother on a few more European vacations, though how they mustered up their bravery to get on another ship is beyond me. And that little gray car that she just couldn't get her mind off of as the Titanic sank, Jules was letting her drive it all the time. It was already practically hers. So she spent a lot of days driving the Detroit to his Long Island home, where she could practice being his wife until it became her reality. Jules was actually doing double duty trying to satisfy both his mistress and his wife once he broke the news to Mrs. Brulatour. You can imagine that Clara was not too happy to hear from her husband of 18 years that he was ready to throw her out of the door and replace her with a younger woman. Not after she had loved and cared for him and had 4 children for him, only 3 were living. He understood that this news would not be easy for his wife to take, so he tried to make her happy too. Well, as happy as one could be given the circumstances. So he offered her a huge cash settlement to take and go live happily ever after. Without him. $20,000 right away, and she would also be the beneficiary of his $65,000 life insurance policy. That $20,000 alone is equivalent to about $630,000 today. Would that be enough money for you to forget about your hurt and embarrassment from a cheating spouse? Let me know. I think that it would be a good start for me. But this offer came with a condition. Clara would have to give him a private separation because he didn't want the embarrassment of a public divorce and the scandal that it would cause. The nerve! Everything was about him and what he wanted. Clara didn't like it, but she wasn't a fool. Jules offered her enough money to keep herself and their kids comfortable for life, so she took him up on the offer. Even though she was angry and didn't care about his reputation being ruined in the press, she didn't want to be embarrassed either. And the thought of the world knowing that her husband had been cheating on her for over a year with this young, silly actress would have been too much shame for her to bear. So she went along with his plan. Everyone was getting what they wanted. Kind of. Jules and Dorothy would get exactly what they wanted. Clara would get the consolation prize of a comfortable living. Everything was going as planned until Dorothy messed it up. And I know that you're probably saying, why would she mess things up? This is what she wanted. Well, she didn't do it on purpose. Here's what happened. One night, a lovely couple, the Smiths, were out for a walk. Dorothy was on one of her many trips from her Manhattan apartment to her lover's Long Island house. Of course, she was driving her favorite car. Maybe she was daydreaming about her wedding, but something distracted her and she jumped a curb. Before she knew it, her favorite car was off of the street and on the sidewalk. She ran into that lovely couple. The woman was Julia Smith, and she sustained serious injuries that left her hospitalized for several weeks. Mr. Henry Smith died. Behind the wheel of her favorite car, Dorothy Gibson killed a man. So how did this cause a hiccup in the arrangements that Jules had made for both of his women? Well, of course, this car accident went very public, but not immediately. At first, Jules was able to keep everything pretty quiet, and it took me a long time to figure out just how. When I was looking for the news articles about this car accident, I couldn't find any at all. Then I accidentally stumbled upon the fact that Dorothy Gibson had been using the name Dora Gibson with everything connected to this fatal accident. She had even been on the stand in court as Dora Gibson. Okay, Dora. Julia Smith sued Dorothy for her husband's death and the injuries that she herself sustained. The amount that she was seeking varies depending on the source. It was somewhere between $4,500 and $25,000. When Dora testified, she told the court that she and Jules were good friends. She was asked how long she had the gray Detroit car. She said a little over a year. Then she was asked if she was friends with Mrs. Brulatour. She said that she was not. She didn't know her. Good friends with him, but you don't know his wife of 18 years? That's suspicious. It was in this line of questioning that it was revealed that the car she was driving, the gray Detroit, wasn't even registered to Dorothy. Dora. Well, whose car was this? The court and newspapers wanted to know. Oh, this car belongs to Jules Brulatour. I was just driving it. Really? Why? Are you driving the car as a business perk? No. Are you driving the car because you and Jules are such great friends? Sure. When Jules took the stand, he testified that Dora was, in fact, his fiancée. That was why she was driving his car. This only makes me wonder about something that I don't know about. When was it required for adults to have identification cards on their persons all the time? Like, there is a very small chance that today you or I could get into a car accident, give a police officer the wrong name, and then show up to court under that same false name. Well, in 1913, Dorothy Gibson did it. And after Jules testified that he was going to marry her, that was a big enough scandal that this married man was going to marry some young woman named Dora. By the way, he mentioned all of that in some weird, horrible effort to help her get out of paying that woman for her husband's death, which I think is disgusting. But guess how the truth about Dorothy's identity came out? She told on herself. There's a Baltimore Sun article from May 1913 that has some details really wrong, like it states that Mr. Brulatour's chauffeur was driving on the night of the wreck, but it has the quote from Dorothy that gave herself away. It starts with her own words. Quote, "You see, ever since the Titanic disaster," she continued glibly, "I have been so nervous that I could not bear to drive the car at a high rate of speed or allow it to be driven fast." Thus, she disclosed her identity. End quote. During all of those court dates, no one knew a thing about her having been on the Titanic. She just let that slip out of her mouth. It was from that detail that everyone was able to figure it out. Jules made that Titanic movie, and that girl in it was Dorothy Gibson. And all of the film industry people already knew about his relationship with her. He had no shame about carrying on with her publicly. And people basically just put two and two together. And there it was. The biggest movie star in the world killed a man with her car. It was more than just a sensational headline. It was a huge lawsuit, and she did have to pay Mrs. Smith. Julia Smith was awarded the $4,500. Well, now, Clara Brulatour had been dragged into this and embarrassed. And with that, Jules no longer had the option to get that quiet, private divorce that he wanted. Remember, she only agreed to keep quiet because her own name wasn't going to be tarnished. But they were beyond that point because of his young, stupid, badly driving, murderous mistress. Now, Jules would have to suffer the shame of a very public divorce and still have to pay Clara a lot of money. I hope that she was worth it, Jules. Clara went on to sue Jules for divorce, and while he didn't get the privacy that he wanted about this matter, Jules finally got to marry the woman of his dreams, Dorothy Gibson, in 1917. She turned out to be a nightmare. They were both still the same people, and now, instead of cheating on their former spouses, they were cheating on each other. The marriage that they had both wanted so badly was over before it started. Dorothy and Jules learned that they both just liked the thrill of the adulterous nature of their affair. Without the excitement of potentially getting caught by their respective spouses, there was really nothing there. Very shortly after they exchanged vows, both Dorothy and Jules found other lovers. According to Jules, Dorothy had 2 lovers. Dirty harlot, he was only cheating on her with one person. We know where this is going, so I won't waste your time. After about 2 years of their charade of a marriage, Dorothy filed for divorce and asked for $48,000 in alimony, $1.1 million in our money today, plus $30,000 for attorney's fees. Well, that was a drop in the bucket for Jules. He was literally a millionaire. He had way more money than that. But he didn't think that she was worth it. Dorothy remembered how Jules offered his first wife, Clara, over $80,000. Well, he didn't think that Dorothy was worth it. Why wasn't she worth a little bit less than that? Instead of agreeing to her demands or offering any money, Jules countersued her for divorce. He was telling the court, "Don't give her a divorce, give me a divorce." He actually wanted his marriage to be annulled on the ground that it was never legal in the first place. And he had a point. And for that reason, even Clara wanted a say in his divorce from Dorothy. This paragraph from a 1919 edition of the Buffalo Times sums it up pretty well. Quote, "His plea for relief coincides with that of his first wife, from whom he obtained a decree of divorce by default in Kentucky in 1917. The first wife asks the marriage of the second wife to Brulatour to be annulled as a fraud upon her rights. She says she never was served with the divorce papers and had no knowledge of the divorce until he had married his second wife. End quote. And he did all of that just so he could be with this woman who he now wanted to get out of his life and out of his house. His houses, actually. This divorce got so dirty. The woman who Jules had left his wife and children for, he was now calling a vampire and saying that she had put him under a spell and forced him to act against his will. That's the only reason that he cheated on his wife and left her. It was all Dorothy's fault. Well, here's how the judge resolved their matter. They got their divorce. Both parties were found to be equally responsible, and Jules was ordered to pay Dorothy $10,000 per year. But the judge was disgusted with both of them and said that neither party deserved any sympathy. He said that he only awarded Dorothy anything at all because he had to follow the law. The following year, Leonard Gibson, Dorothy's stepdad, filed a suit against Jules as well for $50,000. I didn't look into the details of that one because by the time that I saw that, I already had enough material for this video to be over an hour long. During her marriage to Jules, Dorothy continued to conduct herself as the fame-hungry monster that he had helped to create. And Jules, once again, found himself tired of his wife and in search of a younger woman. And he found one. A new actress was on the rise. Her name was Hope Hampton, and she was 8 years younger than the old hag, Dorothy Gibson. Oh, Dorothy, don't you know that when you are promoted from mistress to wife, you create a vacancy for a new mistress? That's just what Hope Hampton was. And Jules was in between Hope's legs before the ink was dry on the marriage certificate that he shared with Dorothy. I guess that Clara got the last laugh. Jules married Hope Hampton in 1923, and Dorothy was so embarrassed about it that she wanted to go and hide, and she literally did. Now, Dorothy got a taste of what it felt like for Clara Brulatour being replaced by her husband's younger mistress. But Dorothy only got a very small taste of it. She couldn't handle the heat, and she needed to get out of the kitchen, or the country. She was too embarrassed to stay in America after her husband had so publicly moved on. In her own words, quote, "I had a great deal of unhappiness and much less money. Mr. Brulatour had married again, and we still had many of the same friends. I was not very happy as my husband and his new wife were always around. Therefore, I went to Paris to live with my mother." End quote. So Dorothy left New York and went to Paris with her mother in tow. The money that Jules was paying her was enough for her to live comfortably in Europe. And there, she partied her nights away, trying the best to forget the shame that was left upon her name back home. She was living it up, drinking cocktails every day, hanging out with famous writers like James Joyce and H.G. Wells and her movie industry friends. And in Paris, she got the opportunity to be the woman on the side without any repercussions from the press. What can I say? She liked being with married men. She and her mom could let loose there. This was the life that they had always wanted. Pauline loved being in Paris so much that she didn't even go back to visit America for her husband's funeral. Eventually, Dorothy came to live a peaceful and quiet existence in France for some years, until trouble struck in 1939. The trouble was big. It was World War II. Pauline was half German, and she developed a strong loyalty to Germany while she and her daughter were living in Europe. She also developed an equal hate for America. She felt like the Germans had gotten a raw deal, bad press during World War I. They were just misunderstood. She didn't know exactly why people were so hard on them. But her loyalty to Germany was more than strong. Pauline was a Nazi sympathizer. and her influence on Dorothy was still ever so strong, and Dorothy became a bit of a Nazi sympathizer too. And these two gals, who always wanted to be on the winning team, thought and hoped that Hitler would win this war, so they sided with him. We all know how that worked out. In 1941, Dorothy's ego took another hit when the film Citizen Kane was released. Now, I have to admit, I've never seen this movie. I'm not much of a movie person at all. But what I read about this movie is that there's a character who has a talentless wife named Susan. Susan was apparently based on Dorothy Gibson. The main character, Charles Kane, is a media mogul like Jules Brulatour. His wife, Susan, takes up opera singing, but she's no good at it, just like Dorothy had done. A gossip columnist named Luella Parsons wrote about the movie that, quote, "It was Brulatour and his sad girls," end quote. Humiliating stuff for sure, but Dorothy had bigger fish to fry. She was in the middle of a war. And this is where things get really strange. For some reason, Dorothy's mother also developed a really strong liking for Mussolini, so she went to live in Italy to be as close to him as possible. Dorothy drove to get Pauline to bring her back to France and ended up getting stuck in Florence with her mother. There, she was interviewed by the Italian police and thrown in jail. She was charged with being an anti-fascist agitator. She didn't like jail at all. It wasn't nearly as luxurious as any place she'd called home in the past 20 years. So she left. She escaped. She tried to get to the Swiss border. Then she was captured and thrown into a Nazi concentration camp. While in prison, she met a double agent who was called Dr. Ugo. He came up with a plan to get himself, Dorothy, and another prisoner who was a journalist out of there. He had some help on the outside from Italian Catholic priests. The scheme that he cooked up was that they were all spies. Dorothy would just have to follow his lead and play along. Her last acting gig. It sounds like something from a corny movie, but believe it or not, his plan worked, and the three made it to Switzerland. But they weren't in the clear just yet. In Zurich, Dorothy was interrogated by authorities because they needed to know just what she knew and what kind of a threat she was. Thankfully for her, she was released because she was determined to be too stupid to be a real spy. One look at her spy work affidavit that she submitted to the American Consulate General, and James Bell said that Dorothy, quote, "hardly seems bright enough to be useful in such capacity," end quote. Sure, she may have been a bit moronic, but that saved her in the end. Authorities sent Dorothy's stupid ass with a one-way ticket back to Paris. There, she made her home in an apartment at the Hotel Ritz. She had a Spanish lover, Emilio Antonio Ramos, who was a press attaché for the Spanish embassy. She didn't get to enjoy a very long relationship with him, though, because she died. And that's all that I can say. On February 17th, 1946, Dorothy Gibson Brulatour died in her apartment, and her death certificate did not list the official cause. By the time of her death, Dorothy was seen as such a joke that Hope Hampton, her husband's younger replacement model, was sometimes mentioned in her obituaries as the present Mrs. Brulatour. Ouch. I think that she deserved a moment to shine solo in her own death. Dorothy had some money and possessions to leave behind, and they were split between her lover and her mother, Pauline, who outlived Dorothy by 15 years. She died in her Paris hotel room in 1961. Dorothy was one of Titanic's many first-class women to be rescued. Another one was Madeline Astor, the young wife of John Jacob Astor. Both ladies became second wives to men roughly twice their ages.
There's the Countess of Ross. And, that's John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. His little wifey there, Madeline, is my age and in a delicate condition. See how she's trying to hide it? Quite the scandal.
Quite the scandal indeed. Thank you, Rose, with your big mouth. Rose was right. This was a scandal. Even though we know that there are weirdos who will say things like, "That was way back in the day. Times were different. It was normal for grown men to be in love with teenagers, blah, blah, blah." It wasn't normal for John Jacob Astor's time, and it certainly was a scandal that he had an 18-year-old wife. The scandal was only compounded by the fact that he had rather recently been divorced from his wife of nearly 20 years who had bore him 2 children, and she was with the in crowd of New York's high society. So this union between John Jacob Astor and Madeline, the new, younger Mrs. Astor, was definitely giving the people something to talk about in 1912, and it's giving us something to talk about today. Nosy Rosie told us that John Jacob Astor was the richest man on the Titanic and that his wife was pregnant. She was telling the truth. John Jacob Astor was born into wealth in 1864. He was a Harvard-educated man who started managing his family's fortune in 1891, 2 years before his second wife was even born. The same year, he married his first wife, Ava. They did the thing that rich society couples do and had a very expensive wedding at her parents' mansion in Philadelphia. Then they went on a several weeks long honeymoon that started in the Poconos and ended on a 5-week trip to Europe. That kind of sounds like the kind of honeymoon that he also had with his second wife who was on the Titanic with him. But, nevertheless, John Jacob Astor and Ava had 2 children, a boy named Vincent and a girl named Ava, after her mother. In 1897, John Jacob Astor built the Astoria Hotel. Today, we know the entire hotel complex as the Waldorf Astoria. But before Astor built the Astoria, his cousin and rival, William Waldorf Astor, had already built the Waldorf Hotel in 1893, 4 years before Astor's Astoria. I'll have to put the rich people rivalry aside for now, but the Waldorf Astoria does play a role in the sinking of the Titanic. I'll get to that in a moment. Years later, after his hotel was built, Astor's marriage started falling apart, and it seems that he was the one to blame. This 1909 edition of the Pensacola News Journal reported on the beginning of the end. Mrs. Astor had returned home from a trip to Europe. Mr. Astor made it his business to be gone 3 days before she arrived. Grounds for divorce? Adultery, with the woman who became his second wife, the teen on the Titanic. This was seen as a huge failure for John Jacob Astor. Divorce is taken pretty casually these days, but in his time, especially for a man of his stature, divorce was a thing of shame. The Astors' relatives, friends, and high society club members were shocked and looking down on John Astor for ruining his family and bringing shame upon their name. Their son, William Vincent, was 17 at the time. Their daughter, Ava Alice, was only 7. Families like this were typically afforded the luxury of keeping their private lives private, only appearing in the newspapers to show off the best sides of their lives, graduations, weddings, business accomplishments, etc. But this story was just too juicy to not discuss, and just like that, the Astors' private lives became public fodder for the news media. Decades before paparazzi photographers were a known thing, here is Ava Astor in a 1909 photo taken by a Buffalo newspaper photographer. The headline brags that she couldn't escape the photographers. John Astor was looked at as an old fool for chasing an 18-year-old. She was just a year older than his son. Astor was 47. But Madeline's mother was going to be sure that her daughter's destiny was to be more than a rich old man's plaything. She would see to it that the Colonel Astor would make an honest woman out of her daughter. Well, it was bad enough when he was cheating with Madeline, but when he married her, his friends and family were infuriated. And that marriage caused Astor to be ostracized from high society, even though he was the richest man in the country. having a net worth of at least $87 million. Some sources claim almost double that. Either way, his net worth would be valued at more than $2 billion today. To give a picture of just how bad it got, check out this Lincoln Star article that was printed just months before the Titanic sank. It shows that the stain of this union with this teenage bride affected more people than his wife and his kids, and even caused one of his cousins to lose his job. Part of the story reads, quote, "The scandal over the marriage of John Jacob Astor and Madeline Forrest caused the present poverty-stricken condition of the Charles Frederick Astors. Charles Frederick, before the wedding, had a good position painting a house for a widow on 91st Street. One day, when the discussion over the wedding was at its height, the widow asked him if he was any relation of John Jacob. Charles Frederick admitted it, and just for that, he was fired the next day." End quote. Poor Charles. All of that is bad enough. But he was supporting his wife and 22-year-old son, who had been working, but couldn't work at that time because his wooden leg had worn out. And here is evidence that the high society people were not a fan of Astor's new bride. There was a very exclusive group called the 400 that was started in the 1880s by Caroline Astor, John Jacob's mother. These were the upper crust of Manhattan. And in January of 1912, John Jacob Astor and his new bride were scheduled to throw a ball for the 400. But as you can see from this paper, he canceled the party because his wife had been snubbed by the high society crowd. Hoping that if he got out of town for long enough, that the people would stop hating his wife and thinking that he was a jackass, John Jacob took his wife on a long honeymoon. They went to Europe and Egypt for several weeks. And when it was said that the biggest, most luxurious ship that had ever been made was taking its maiden voyage to New York, it only made sense that J.J. Astor would book a trip on it for himself, his wife, and their unborn child. And the fact that this ship was unsinkable was a major plus. Well, as we know, the Titanic was not unsinkable. After it hit the iceberg on April 14th at 11:40 p.m., John did everything in his power to tend to his wife. He saw to it that Madeline, her maid, and her nurse made it into a lifeboat. He hired a nurse to travel with them because of her pregnancy. She was 5 months at the time that the Titanic went down. Astor was told that he could not accompany his wife in the lifeboat, so he walked away after seeing that Madeline and her staff were secure. By the following evening, newspapers all over the globe had headlines about the Titanic sinking. And as with any big news story, when it was first reported, a lot of the details were wrong. Like this April 15th edition of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which reported that John Astor was among the notable passengers who was taken off of the Titanic and were alive. His wife is also listed here, and it is true that she was taken off. But there are a number of names on this page who, like John Jacob Astor, were not taken off of the ship and died that night or very early morning. Ironically, the Titanic was not the only boat that J.J. Astor had been on that triggered news reports questioning his safety. Shortly after his divorce, Astor and his son were on his yacht while on a visit to Puerto Rico, and he was thought to have been lost in a hurricane. After he was found alive, papers reported that his ex-wife was relieved to learn that her son was unharmed. But back to April 1912. Eventually, by the next day or two, the correct word got out that J.J. Astor was among those who were dead. I do think that part of the reason that so many papers were reporting the men in first class were alive when they were actually dead was that there was an assumption that first-class passengers would be saved first because of their money and status. And for the most part, that was true. That was and is the way of the world. And one cannot help but notice that the newspapers gave the same preferential coverage to the rich and famous. But here are the names of Joseph Laroche and his family. He was the only man of Haitian descent on the Titanic. a biracial man who is too often called the only black man on the Titanic. I published a video about him that I will link in the description box, in case you haven't already seen it. The sinking of the Titanic resulted in 2 inquiries, one by the British Wreck Commissioner in London, the other by the United States Senate that was held in New York City, at the Waldorf Astoria. I told you that, come back to it. It does seem a little ironic, maybe even eerie, that a hotel built by one of the most talked about passengers on the Titanic ends up being the place where his death is discussed. His death along with so many others, of course. One passenger testified that he saw John Jacob Astor clinging to a raft with English journalist William Stead. Stead is considered to be the father of investigative journalism. He died along with Astor and over 1,500 other people in the wee hours of April 15th, 1912. Astor's body was recovered. Most were not. He is buried at the Trinity Churchyard in Manhattan. His widow gave birth to their son, August 14th, 1912. J.J. Astor left his son a $3 million trust and Madeline an outright sum of $100,000. As long as she didn't remarry, she was also entitled to the income from a $5 million trust fund and use of his house on Fifth Avenue. But she did remarry, more than once, and one of those marriages was awful and embarrassing for her.
There's the Countess of Ross. And, that's John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. His little wifey there, Madeline, is my age and in a delicate condition.
We know, Rose.
See how she's trying to hide it? Quite the scandal.
You already told us that.
And that's Benjamin Guggenheim and his mistress, Madame Aubert.
Oh.
Mrs. Guggenheim is at home with the children, of course.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it. In the immediate days after the Titanic sank, there was a frenzy amongst the relatives of its passengers to get information on their loved ones, hoping that the ones they knew beat the odds and were among the survivors. Incorrect headlines had been printed, reflecting that people who had in fact died were alive. People like John Jacob Astor and Isidore and Ida Strauss. There was even uncertainty about who had even boarded the ship to begin with, as can be seen in this notice that was printed in the Buffalo News on April 16, 1912, that shows that Benjamin Guggenheim's brother had some questions of his own. Quote, Senator Guggenheim of Colorado, in telephone consultation with the White Star Line officials in New York today, was unable to learn of the fate of his brother, Benjamin Guggenheim, reputed one of the wealthiest men in the world. So far as known, his wife did not accompany him. Well, his wife certainly did not accompany him. That might have made the trip rather odd for his mistress. For a lot of us, when we hear the name Guggenheim, the first thing that comes to mind is the Guggenheim. Maybe we don't think of its full name, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, but today's subject, Benjamin Guggenheim, is part of that Guggenheim family. Like a number of the men who traveled in first class on the RMS Titanic in April of 1912, he was one of the wealthiest in the world. He, like his brothers, made his fortune on the coattails and name of his father, Mayor Guggenheim. He started out in the importing business in the 1840s and eventually made his huge fortune in the mining and smelting industries, leaving generational wealth for his 10 children who he had with his wife, Barbara. 7 boys and 3 girls. Most of his sons went into the family business. The Guggenheim is the namesake of one of those sons, Solomon. Benjamin Guggenheim was an industry captain of mining and smelting and helped to expand the family business into Europe. He married his wife in 1894. They had 3 daughters together. Yet he had a reputation for being a playboy around New York City. Now, I have long heard this narrative that Benjamin Guggenheim went down on the Titanic in true playboy fashion, dressed in his best, saying that he was prepared to go down like a gentleman. But I never really understood exactly why people said that about him, that he had a reputation for being a playboy. Yes, he was traveling on the Titanic with his French mistress, but that could have been a very unlucky and isolated incident. But after searching through 5 years' worth of newspapers, I finally saw that it wasn't an isolated incident, and that Benjamin Guggenheim had a cheating scandal that made it to the papers in 1907. It is very evident from newspaper articles and stories that Benjamin Guggenheim and his wife lived very separate lives. He was always in Europe for weeks and even months at a time. In fact, most of the times he was written about, it was regarding his departure from or returning to America. And his wife often attended parties solo or threw her own parties without him present. Benjamin Guggenheim being caught out on sea with a mistress was likely a big surprise to no one, because 5 years before the Titanic sank, he was named as a co-respondent in a divorce suit that another man, Samuel Tuska, brought against his wife, Amy Goldsmith Tuska, when he caught her in the act in his apartment with Benjamin Guggenheim. While most headlines about the Guggenheim-Tuska affair put it as gently as they could, the Morning Post on April 30th, 1907, took another approach and spelled it out quite clearly in the biggest font offered at the time. Their headline read, "Rich Man in Her Bedroom. Brother of United States Senator Guggenheim implicated in a divorce suit. Husband broke in door to get evidence." Well, so here's what the story says. Of course, when you're from a family as rich and powerful and famous as the Guggenheims, when you have a tiny little slip-up and happen to find yourself in the bed of a woman who is someone else's wife, the media is going to pull your whole family into the situation. So this article actually starts off talking about Benjamin Guggenheim's brother, Senator Simon Guggenheim, as if the readers would have confused Benjamin with some other guy named Benjamin Guggenheim. Anyway, it's the husband who filed for divorce, a man named Samuel Tuska. He was also a rich businessman. Not Guggenheim rich, but he held the positions of treasurer, director, and president of multiple companies, rich enough to move in the same circles as the Guggenheims. His wife was Amy Goldsmith Tuska, and he had been granted an absolute divorce from her. The couple had a son, a 6-year-old named Robert, and Samuel was awarded full custody of him. According to the terms of the decree, Mrs. Tuska would have to apply at some later date for what we would now call visitation. But at the time the divorce was granted, she did not have the, quote, privilege of seeing the lad. And she lost another privilege in the divorce, one that she would not be able to regain at a later date. For, also according to the decree, she was not permitted to marry ever again. Well, that should have taught her to not mess over Samuel Tuska. All the parties involved, the Tuskas, the Goldsmiths, and especially Benjamin Guggenheim, did all that they could to keep this story private, and for good reason. Each of their families was a part of high society, and this story would be a bad look for each party in a different way. The Goldsmiths didn't want their daughter and sister to be seen as a trollop. I'm sure that Amy herself didn't want that either. Mr. Tuska certainly would not have wanted his own manhood called into question, but how could anyone think anything differently with another man coming into his home to serve as his wife? And the prominent and upright business leader, husband, and father Benjamin Guggenheim certainly didn't need for the world to know that he was an adulterer. Each family separately had enough money, power, and influence to keep the story concealed for some time, so the combined power of all three families kept the story out of the news until the court was finished with the case, and even then, the judge ordered that the papers in the case were to be sealed. Even though all of the murky details never made it to the press, it was made very clear that the nail in the coffin of the Tuska marriage was Benjamin Guggenheim being caught not only inside of Amy Tuska's bedroom, but inside of Amy Tuska. Quote, "It was learned, however, that the divorce had been obtained on testimony that showed that Benjamin Guggenheim had been surprised under embarrassing circumstances in the apartment of Mrs. Tuska, end quote. And even though the Morning Post headline implies that it was Amy's husband who found her in bed with Benjamin, it's made clear from multiple reports that there were in fact 2 men hired by Samuel Tuska who broke into the apartment to catch the 2 in the throes of passion. Samuel must have had his suspicions. Every bit of the story is written in a flashback style because no one outside of the involved parties knew anything. So, right after the affair was discovered, the Tuskas separated. They had lived separately for over a year leading up to the trial, and only a handful of their closest friends even knew that. And the ones who knew that they were separated didn't know why. Nobody had a clue that Benjamin Guggenheim had been sleeping with Amy. And just like that, Amy lost her husband, her son, and her close friend, Florette. Who was Florette? I'm glad you asked. Florette Seligman. Florette Seligman Guggenheim. Benjamin's wife. Yeah, she was sleeping with her close friend's husband. So you can imagine that it was a shock to everyone who saw the story in the papers, because by that time, everything was settled. Had this story played out in the public eye in real time, there would have been hundreds, maybe even thousands of news articles about it. But Samuel Tuska moved in silence. As soon as the word got back to him that Benjamin was having sex with his wife, he hired a divorce attorney, a family member named Benjamin also, Benjamin Tuska. And they got the ball rolling on the divorce immediately. After Amy was served divorce papers, she hired an attorney and denied the claims. But since she was caught getting Guggenheimed, nobody believed her, and the divorce went through per her husband's wishes. Even though she claimed her innocence and didn't want the divorce, she went out as gracefully as she could have, considering the circumstances. She didn't ask for alimony, which is good because Samuel certainly wasn't going to give her any. But it's not like she lived out the remainder of her life in poverty. She came from a wealthy family too, and was an heiress in her own right, thanks to her father's fortune. Benjamin Guggenheim sent in a written denial to the court via his attorney. His friends were surprised and upset with him because they thought that if the allegations weren't true, then he should have gone further to protect his own image and Amy's also. They thought that if he really wanted to set the record straight, he would have gone before the court to give oral testimony. Perhaps he was too tired from already having given oral... Never mind. The judge, who was called a referee in this ruling, could only disclose to the media that the testimony of the 2 men who walked in on Benjamin and Amy was, quote, sensational in character. Now, at the time the news broke, all of the involved parties knew that the year-old story was finally going to become public. So, most likely in an effort to ride out the storm with as little embarrassment as possible, Amy Goldsmith Tuska went away to Paris in early April of 1907, 3 weeks prior to the public announcement. Guess who else was in Paris when the story broke? Benjamin Guggenheim. But don't worry, he probably wasn't stuffing his sausage into Amy's croissant. He took his wife and kids with him. And oh yeah, his wife had no idea about any part of this story. I guess that Benjamin thought that his wife might take the news better while taking a stroll down the Champs-Élysées. Remember, this story broke on the last day of April. Guggenheim's lawyer told the papers that Benjamin wasn't feeling well, but would be back to visit New York City for business in June, no doubt bringing his whole family back with him from Paris. Then after that, according to Attorney Leavenworth, because Benjamin had not been feeling well for the last 8 months, perhaps his stomach was feeling a little queasy from his worries about this story breaking, but anyway, because Benjamin had not been feeling well for the last 8 months, he would live abroad for most of the time the next year. That is almost a verbatim quote from his attorney. Reading between the lines, it sounds like Benji Boy was leaving his wife at home to deal with the shame of his affair that became public, while he went back to Europe and did whatever he wanted to do. Or whomever he wanted to do. And with that said, I think that we now know one of the reasons why Benjamin Guggenheim had a reputation for being a playboy. He earned it fairly. And on his last transatlantic trip on the Titanic in April of 1912, Benjamin was returning home to his wife and children with his Parisian mistress on board with him. Now, let's fast forward 5 years to April of 1912. That puts Benjamin Guggenheim on the RMS Titanic after one of his many extended trips to France. Perhaps he brought back some Eiffel Tower snowballs for his daughters and held them in safekeeping in his luxury cabin. But without a doubt, the biggest souvenir that he was bringing home from Paris was for himself. It was his mistress. When the Titanic made its maiden and final voyage not quite across the Atlantic Ocean in April of 1912, she was carrying some of the richest people on the planet. American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim was in that number. He had made this trip back and forth from New York to Paris several times in order to conduct business for the family empire. And as far as his wife knew, or at least as far as she cared to put on for the public, all of the European trips that he took without her were business trips. But Benjamin was known to mix business with pleasure. He had highly profitable business operations in Europe, so he would often make a lot of transatlantic trips. But beyond offering a destination to handle his business, Europe, and France in particular, was a place where he could cheat on his wife in peace and not have to worry about those nosy American news reporters. For there was certainly evidence on record that he didn't mind cheating on his wife. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence of a divorce suit filed by Mrs. Guggenheim to get rid of her cheating husband. By this time, his wife knew. Heck, everybody knew. But she seemed to be content to turn a blind eye to his cheating. Shut her mouth and endure, because that was her price to pay for the privilege of being able to call herself Mrs. Guggenheim. All of this to say that it's absolutely no surprise that Benjamin would have been coming home to New York from Paris with a mistress in tow, flaunting her on the ship in front of all of those friends that he and his wife shared in common. Oddly enough, Guggenheim had been in perilous conditions on sea 2 years before the Titanic sank with one of the Titanic's most controversial survivors, J. Bruce Ismay. He was the agent of the White Star Line, the man who was famously portrayed in James Cameron's Titanic film as the man who pushed the captain to speed across the Atlantic in order to make record time and to make headlines, and as the coward who got into a lifeboat along with women and children instead of dying an honorable death along with the other gentlemen. Well, in 1910, Ismay and Guggenheim were on the Mauretania, which was also referenced in the Titanic movie, and the two men happened to be aboard the Mauretania during a storm that caused the captain to have to cut down her speed. On that voyage, Benjamin Guggenheim was returning home from Paris after having established a factory there for his business, the International Steam Pump Company, to perform work for the French government. And it is highly likely that it was on a business trip like this one that he would have met his mistress who left Paris with him to travel to New York aboard the Titanic. Her name was Léontine Aubert. Léontine was born in Paris in 1887. She was 24 years old when she boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg, France. Benjamin, by the way, was 47. Léontine went by the name Ninette. She was a nightclub singer. Benjamin paid for her ticket and also the ticket of her maid, Emma, and his valet, Victor. For the first few days, it was nothing but partying it up on the grandest vessel to ever hit the waters, with Benjamin acting like he didn't have a wife in New York City, dining and dancing with Ninette and having a blast while his wife was at home, being a mother to their daughters. But trouble came at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, when Titanic hit the iceberg. After the collision, Leontine and her maid Emma went to see what had caused it. They went to inform Benjamin and his valet, telling them that the ship had struck an iceberg, to which Victor replied, "Never mind icebergs. What is an iceberg?" Then, like many of their fellow passengers, Leontine and Emma grew unconcerned after learning about the collision because they knew that their ship was unsinkable. So Leontine returned to cabin B35, her luxury stateroom, to go back to bed. But not long after, she would have to get up again, along with her maid, and they would not be returning to their cabins. They left their rooms in order to get up on deck and into a lifeboat, for the unsinkable ship was in fact sinking. Benjamin and his valet saw to it that Leontine and her maid both escaped the disaster, helping them get into lifeboat number 9. Translated from French to English, this is how Leontine described it. Quote, "We were in our night clothes. Lifebelts were put around us. On the deck, there was no commotion. Every one of them a perfect gentleman, calmly puffing cigarettes and cigars and watching the women and children being placed in the boats. Emma got into the lifeboat, and then I. We were the last women to leave the ship. Those Englishmen, still with cigarettes in mouth, facing the death so bravely that it was all the more terrible." End quote. From the safety of lifeboat number 9, both Leontine and Emma would endure the freezing cold of the wee hours of the morning, then be rescued by the Carpathia. As for Benjamin and his valet, Victor, there would be no lifeboat, no rescue ship. After Benjamin went to wake up his mistress to tell her to get on deck because the ship was sinking, he reportedly gave this message to a steward: "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife I've done my best in doing my duty." There don't seem to be any reports of Benjamin Guggenheim trying to save himself. He and Victor changed into their finest evening clothes and waited to die. And after both men helped many women and children get into lifeboats, Titanic survivor Rose Ickard said that she saw Benjamin put a rose in his buttonhole, and she heard him say, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And that's what happened. Both men went down with Titanic, and neither body was ever recovered. That was the end of his life, but that would not be the end of Guggenheim's scandals. Meanwhile, on the Carpathia, Leontine was able to send a Marconigram to let her loved ones in Paris know that she had survived. And after that, she pretty much had a mental breakdown. All that she could have known was that whatever plans she had made with Benjamin were as dead as he was. He was her meal ticket in every sense of the word. And because she didn't speak English, he was her connection to the world that he was bringing her to. Needless to say, things didn't work out as they had planned. And I must say that I wonder what their plan was exactly. Benjamin was bringing Ninette to his hometown. Was she to live in his house with his family, and his wife was just going to tolerate his having a mistress? Was he going to bring her to live with his family under the guise of her being a new house servant? Then he could sneak off to her quarters in the middle of the night for sex? Was he going to put her up in an apartment close enough to his home and just go visit her every chance that he got? I really wonder what their plan was. I wonder all the more after finding this newspaper quote about her, which was almost impossible to find. Her name was Leontine, but she was often called Ninette by close relations. Her last name was Aubert, Aubart, but it was often misspelled as Aubert, Aubert, which apparently is a more common French last name. And that's something that I did not know, but I learned thanks to Grace from the Grace Report channel on YouTube.
who lives in Paris and helped me out with these names.
So this is the only quote that I ever found regarding her condition, and that was after searching for the wrong name. On April 20th, 1912, the New York Star-Eagle printed a long story about how Titanic survivors were faring only days after the disaster. Quote, one French woman in particular, Mrs. Ninette Aubert of Paris, was nearly insane with grief. Her husband has been lost. End quote. Her husband. This had to have gotten back to Mrs. Guggenheim, but clearly none of the writers of that day were able to put together that she had been traveling with one of the most famous men whose name was often in big, bold letters in their other Titanic stories, and that the husband who Ninette was speaking of was none other than the already married Benjamin Guggenheim. I guess that the entire passenger list was taking the what happens on Titanic stays on Titanic approach as far as the press was concerned. After arriving in New York and receiving basic medical treatment, Leontine was able to return to France in early May of 1912, thanks to the White Star Line for making travel arrangements possible for her and her maid to return to Europe on their ship called the Adriatic. This was roughly 3 weeks after the sinking, and her nerves were still, understandably, such a wreck that when she boarded the Adriatic, Leontine had forgotten to bring her steamer, which likely would have been the largest piece of luggage she had. She also left her train tickets that she needed for the final leg of her trip. But eventually, she and Emma made it back home to Paris, and after she had a while to take a deep breath and collect her thoughts, she did what many Titanic survivors eventually got around to doing, and that was suing White Star Line. She was recovering from losing everything. Most of what she owned was what Benjamin had purchased for her, and it all went down with the ship. So when it came time to list all that she needed to be compensated for, she got very detailed. Leontine wanted to be paid for getting sick and suffering permanent injuries from having been subjected to the cold air when she was on the lifeboat. After all, she was rather scantily clad because she had been dressed for bed. She claimed to have been sick, sore, and lame. She also wanted compensation for mental pain, anguish, distress, and impaired senses and faculties. She said that her health and constitution were shattered and her nervous system had been permanently affected. And then, of course, she placed a claim for her lost belongings. I had many trunks of hats and dresses. Nothing could be taken with me. She also had 4,000 pounds worth of jewels in her cabin that Benjamin Guggenheim had purchased for her. And of course, she included that in her suit as well. That's quite an expensive lot of jewelry, especially for a mistress. Now, why was that 4,000 pounds worth of jewels so important? It shouldn't have been, at least not to a millionaire. And that's what Benjamin Guggenheim was, right? A millionaire? That's what all the newspapers said. That's how he lived his life. Well, when his wife, Florette, and their daughters got what was left of his money, she said that she felt like a poor relation. Why was that? After the affair that made the news in 1907, and also after openly flaunting his mistress on the Titanic, Benjamin would embarrass his wife one more time after his death, when it came to his will. But let's get back to the mistress. Leontine, along with many other Titanic survivors, tried to recoup all that they could. Collectively, they wanted to get about $6 million from the luxury ship company. As we all know, Leontine was on the ship with someone else's husband, who she claimed to be her husband. In your opinion, did she deserve to get anything back from White Star Line? I wonder if she ever told them who her quote-unquote husband was. Nothing in print from 1912 ties them together. I did happen to find a passenger list that shows their names on the same page, but nowhere close to each other. But because of how public and open Benjamin was with their relationship, everything in me believes that the news of Leontine got back to Mrs. Guggenheim. And frankly, I believe that the secrecy that the Guggenheims wanted to keep about his cheating with Mrs. Tosca in 1907, they were successful in obtaining when it came to his Titanic mistress, Leontine. Because there was virtually no mention of her in New York publications after the sinking. But, thanks to Encyclopedia Titanica, there is a little information about Leontine, aka Ninette, after she got home to Paris. Very little information, in fact. There are her Marconigram telegrams, which were in French, but thankfully translated to English. The one that actually was transmitted simply said, "I'm saved, but Ben is lost." The one that didn't go through was meant to let family and friends back home know that she and Emma had both been saved. Beyond that, it is written that Leontine threw some wild parties in the 1920s that got so out of hand that police officers often had to show up to shut them down. She died on October 29th, 1964, just months after her maid, at the age of 77. As for Benjamin, I believe that death on the Titanic was probably easier for him to face than facing his financial reality in front of his wife back home. On May 8th, 1912, about 2 months after his death, the Wall Street Journal had estimated his estate to be worth somewhere between $5 million to $10 million. Then, in December of the following year, 1913, the Wall Street Journal confirmed that, in fact, at the time of Benjamin Guggenheim's death, he owned little more than stock in the International Steam Pump Company. Here's how the Sunday People summed it up. Quote, Mrs. Guggenheim was to discover her husband had squandered $8 million on bad investments. She said she felt like a poor relation when he left his 3 children $500,000. End quote. Well, that is a lot of money missing from what she expected. But that made the remaining Guggenheims broke. But rich people broke, not poor people broke. Adjusted for inflation, that $500,000 in 1913 is worth a little more than $15 million today in 2023. But it's still a far cry from the $5 to $10 million that all the papers reported was his estimated net worth. The $8 million his wife was sure that she and her daughters would get. Oddly enough, when another death hit the family in 1913, this time on Florette Guggenheim's side of the family, the Seligman side, it might have seemed like another opportunity for her to get her hands on some of the family fortune, but it didn't turn out that way for her after her brother, Washington Seligman, committed suicide. Much like her own husband, Florette's brother's fortune was significantly less than what everyone thought it was. His $1 million net worth was reduced to a mere $138,000 after his debts were paid, and $50,000 of that was to go to a quote-unquote friend of his named Anita Sutherland before anyone else got anything. And with only $88,000 left to go around, Florette Guggenheim wouldn't have been able to get much of her brother's money anyway. But the truth was that even if his $1 million had been available at the time of his death and intact, Mrs. Guggenheim wouldn't have gotten any of it anyway. He had left his sister out of his will, not due to bad blood or anything like that. His thought was that she had married well and would not need any money. He had the same clause in place for one of his brothers, Jefferson. His will reading, quote, "Not because I entertain less affection toward either of them than toward any of my other brothers and sisters, but because their circumstances in life are more fortunate than those of my other brothers and sisters." End quote. It was an understandable assumption on her brother's part. The Guggenheim name was synonymous with wealth, Benjamin Guggenheim died relatively broke, but in his lifetime he did earn millions of dollars. And a huge factor in his being able to do so was the head start that he was given by his father when his father left Benjamin and his siblings very healthy sums of money after his death. And that's something that Benjamin wasn't able to do on the same scale for his own children. It can often be sad or funny in an ironic way to look at how a thing begins versus how it ends. I stumbled upon a story about the wedding of Benjamin Guggenheim and Florette Seligman. The story was printed on the day after their October 24th wedding in 1894. It sounded like it must have been a beautiful occasion held at Delmonico's, which is arguably the genesis for fine dining in America. There were exotic, expensive flowers all over the restaurant, inside and outside, and even on Florette's dress. Florette gave her bridesmaids diamond pins for their gifts. But Florette was the recipient of diamonds and other jewels on that day too. Quote, "The many gifts received by the bride included several checks, each representing a good-sized fortune. Rarely have such handsome jewels of all kinds and in every conceivable setting been received as gifts by one person." End quote. I would like to think that Florette, like many brides, cherished and kept a lot of her wedding presents, and therefore maybe, just maybe, she kept all of those jewels that were gifted to her. So in the end, there is poetic justice for the wife, and not the mistress whose jewels were lost at sea with the man she cheated with.
I thought tonight.
Good gracious.
Perhaps as a reminder of my feelings for you.
Is it a
Diamond? Yes. 56 carats to be exact. It was worn by Louis XVI, and they called it Le Coeur de la Mer. The heart of the ocean, yes.
She's not worth it, Cal. Give it to me. Oh, excuse me, I got a little carried away there. Bravo to Billy Zane. Takes my breath away every time, doesn't he, ladies? We know that James Cameron's Titanic story revolves around the love story of a fictional couple. The poor lad dies and the crazy old woman tosses that beautiful, exquisite piece of jewelry into the ocean instead of giving it to her granddaughter, which would have made more sense to everyone watching. We all agree with that. Now, what was the inspiration for The Heart of the Ocean, and who was wearing it? Well, the movie's design is based on the Hope Diamond. The magnificent 45-carat stone was extracted from a mine in India, and it has a history similar to the one that Cal described in the Titanic movie, though its real history is much more extensive. But there was a man on the Titanic, a second-class passenger, who gave a young woman, his traveling companion, a similar necklace. It was actually a deep blue oblong sapphire that graced the neck of his sweetheart. And sources say that this couple's story laid the groundwork for The Heart of the Ocean to make its way into the script of Titanic. It's a fascinating and scandalous story, so I'm going to tell it. His name was Henry Samuel Morley. Her name was Kate Florence Phillips. They were both from England and boarded the Titanic in Southampton. But if you look at the Titanic passenger lists, you won't see either of those names. You will see Mr. and Mrs. Henry Marshall. That was them. And they had a secret. They actually had a couple of secrets, but Henry died before learning one of them. He planned on starting a new life with Kate in America, San Francisco, California to be exact, and that alone is so romantic and so boring. The problem with Henry taking off to marry Kate was that he already had a wife in England and a child too. How messy. Just the way we like it. And the days didn't get much better for Kate as time marched on after the Titanic disaster. This is the story of an illicit love affair that never took off because fate had other plans. And Kate thought that she would be able to run off into the sunset and away from England with Mrs. Morley's husband. But an iceberg disagreed with her. Henry Samuel Morley is the man of our story. He was born in Middlesex, England on May 3rd, 1873. His father, William, was a tailor. His mother, Emily, was a tailoress and gave birth to a total of 9 children, including Henry. 6 survived. Tragedy fell on the family in 1889 when Henry's father died at the beginning of the year. Henry was only 15 and took on work as a grocer's clerk. The year after his father died, Henry's mother was still listed on the 1890 census as a tailoress. Henry was still listed as a grocer's clerk, but he was also listed as a frock cutter, which suggests perhaps that he was cutting the material that his mother used to make dresses, helping her keep the family business going in his father's absence. It appears as though Henry was a hard-working young man who was dedicated to his family. 10 years later, Henry married Louisa Price and moved away from his family's home. In the early years of his marriage, he worked as a grocer's manager. Shortly after getting married, the couple welcomed their one and only child into the world, a baby girl named Doris Louisa, who was born in 1900. After baby Doris was born, the financial picture for the Morleys got a lot sweeter. That's when Henry and his brother opened a candy shop called L. Morley Brothers Confectioners. Henry was a senior partner in this family affair. The shop was making so much money that it allowed Henry to buy a home big enough for his wife and child, his mother, his Aunt Alice, and his nephew Vincent. His Aunt Alice worked as an assistant for the business. It was performing so well that Morley Brothers decided to open a second location and then a third in Birmingham. The expansion kept going. By 1911, there were a total of 8 shops under the names L. Morley Brothers Confectioners and the Purveyors of High-Class Confectionery, and they were making high-end candy. The shop's locations were in Birmingham, Worcester, and Malvern. L. Morley Brothers Confectioners had made Henry into a rich man. He would have been a millionaire by today's standards. In addition to making Henry rich, the candy shop is also where this story starts to get messy, because Henry needed to hire some help, and he was looking for a woman to come in and give him a hand. Then in walked Kate, who was half his age and ready and willing to provide whatever service he needed. I can't believe it, but I found the want ad that Kate most likely answered, or one very similar to it, in a 1909 edition of the Gloucestershire Echo. It read, quote, "Wanted, young lady as apprentice to confectionery. Wages paid. Particulars apply L. Morley Confectioner, 336 High Street." End quote. Not a very detailed description, but whatever Henry was looking for in his next confectionery employee, Kate had it. And let's just say that from that point, the lollipops weren't the only sweet things in the candy shop that were getting Henry's attention. He had a little too much focus on the newly hired eye candy. So let's talk about her. Here's a little background information on Kate. Her full name was Kate Florence Phillips. She was a New Year's baby, born on January 1st, 1893 in Kings Norton, Birmingham, England. Her father, Thomas, was an engine fitter. Kate's mother's name was Mary. Including Kate, her parents had 5 children. They shared a house that backed onto the River Severn. At some point, her family moved. The 1911 census shows her family residing at 34 Waterworks Road, Worcester, an address that would remain important to Kate well into her adulthood. She was described as an unmarried confectionery shop assistant, employed by Henry Samuel Morley in that census report. But the census didn't keep up with the data on extramarital affairs. By the time that Kate met Henry Morley to work in his shop, She was an attractive teenager. I don't know Henry's height, but I read that he towered over Kate. I don't know her exact height, but I read that she was shorter than 5 feet tall, so I'm sure that many men towered over her. That leads me to believe that there's a good chance that Henry wasn't necessarily exceptionally tall if he towered over a woman who was not taller than 4 feet and 11 inches. Kate was also described as someone who didn't own much of anything, so she must have been surprised, flattered, and excited when she learned that her boss, the older and well-off Henry, took a liking to her. But it was more than like. Maybe it was love for Henry, maybe it was lust. Whatever it was, Henry started having sex with Kate, carrying on as if he didn't have a wife and child at home. By 1912, he was 39, and he was spending money on hotels, taking Kate to places where the two of them could engage in sexual activity. It was a different time. Today, if you book a hotel, the company will know who you are before you even pull into the parking lot. You will likely already have shared your name, driver's license number, and a credit or debit card number with your hotel brand. But in Henry's time, you could check into a hotel and give any name that you wanted at the front desk. As long as you paid your bill, no one cared. So that's how Henry was able to take his mistress wherever he wanted to have his way with her. He would give the front desk whatever name he wanted to give for himself, and Kate would simply become Mrs. whatever name he wanted to give himself. That's how he got away with it at hotels. I don't know how he got away with that at home. Maybe Henry would tell his wife that he had to go to candy-making conventions. Yeah, babe, the International Candy and Chocolate Association is doing a thing, and I gotta be there, so see you in a few days. I don't know. Or maybe Mrs. Morley would turn a blind eye to his cheating. Like I said, he was practically a millionaire. And if his wife chose to not acknowledge his cheating, she wouldn't have been the first wife of a rich man to shut her mouth in exchange for a comfortable lifestyle. Whatever it was, love or lust or a little bit of both, it didn't take long for it to get serious in Henry's mind, because he started making plans, lifelong plans for himself and Kate. He wanted to marry Kate, but he was going to have to keep it a bit of a secret because of Louisa, that pesky problem at home, his wife, the old ball and chain, getting in the way of him and his sweet young thing. You know how it goes, right, fellas? Wives. What are you going to do about them? Don't kill me, ladies, I'm just kidding. But seriously, Henry had an entire plan worked out for an elopement, and he started putting the pieces in motion. First, he sold his shares in his confectionery shops so that he and Kate would have money to live on, and so he'd have capital for his next business venture. His plan was to move with Kate to San Francisco, California. There, he would start a new confectionery business. He also used some of the money to buy his sweetheart an engagement present. It was a diamond-encrusted sapphire necklace. Well, I shouldn't say that he merely bought it. He had it specially made for Kate in Birmingham's Jewelry Quarter. It was an expensive piece with a name, L'amour de la mer, the love of the ocean. I'm sure that you recall the one in James Cameron's Titanic was called Le Coeur de la Mer, the heart of the ocean. Henry used some more of his money to purchase a joint ticket for himself and Kate to get to the United States. It was ticket number 250655, a second-class ticket on the Titanic, which cost him £26. Henry did his best to plan every detail down to the T, because he needed to make a clean getaway. He could not risk getting his good name dirty while he snuck off to do something dirty. And he was going to need a little help to pull off everything. So he decided to tell one person what his real plans were. He told his brother, Arthur. Henry told everyone else a completely different story. Henry had been rather ill in the months before the Titanic's maiden voyage. And while we could probably all agree that there's never really a right time to be sick, The timing of Henry's illness was rather convenient because it gave him an alibi or an out for his escape plan. While his brother, Arthur, knew that Henry was leaving the country to start a new life with Kate, Henry told his wife and the rest of his family that he was leaving England to go to San Francisco to recuperate from his illness. That's right. According to his doctor, as he told everyone, the warmer climate would help him to recover more quickly. He would need to leave for 6 months, and then he would be in tip-top shape, and he'd be ready to come back home. Who was his doctor? Marvin Gaye? Because it's so clear that the only healing Henry was in search of was sexual healing. His brother, Arthur, had a little more to say about Henry's plans, but we'll get there. On March 2nd, 1912, Henry withdrew 400 pounds from the United Counties Bank Limited and pretended to be a good little husband and father until it was time to set sail from Southampton aboard the Ship of Dreams on April 10th, 1912, shortly after noon. Henry was abandoning his family forever. But forevers don't always last a long time, do they? April 10th was a new day and a world away from what Henry and Kate had known. That was the day that the couple eloped together on the Titanic, full of hope, with their new life ahead of them. What had started out in a candy shop as a clandestine affair between Henry Morley and Kate Phillips had transformed into a serious relationship on the Titanic between Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, the fake names on their tickets. Like so many of the other passengers who boarded the Wonder ship, Henry and Kate exchanged their ticket for entry onto the vessel, then waved their goodbyes to the lookers-on. Among those waving them off on the quay was Henry's brother, Arthur, the only person in the crowd who knew their dirty little secret. According to Henry's great-granddaughter, Arthur is the one who drove the couple to Southampton so that they could make their escape. He was especially instrumental in their plan. Arthur kept his lips tight, and Henry and Kate were so thankful for it. But there would come a time when Kate would hope that Arthur would reverse that favor and speak on this adulterous relationship, and we'll get there. Now we're on the Titanic. And I'm sure that the mere sight of the ship blew Kate away. She was from a working-class family and would never have seen such luxury and splendor before, even in second class. As has often been said of Titanic, second class on Titanic was first class on any other vessel. Henry certainly could have afforded first-class tickets for himself and Kate, but his fear was that traveling in first class would have drawn too much attention. Nevertheless, the couple had everything that they needed to start their new life merrily, right in their second-class accommodation. Second-class staterooms were very comfortable and pretty. They featured oak paneling, glossy white linoleum floors, and mahogany furniture, which, in addition to their double beds, consisted of a large sofa, a wardrobe, and a dressing table with a wash basin, mirror, and storage shelves. Their bed linen was changed daily by a ship's steward. Now, the part that we might not think of as luxurious today would have been their bathroom facilities. Though second class on Titanic was pleasant, second-class bathroom facilities were shared. They were communal lavatories that may have been shared with passengers from 8 different cabins, and if Henry or Kate or any second-class passengers wanted to take a bath on their voyage, they could, if they made their request with the steward and scheduled it. Hey, it was second class. Not as luxurious as first class, but way better off than their fellow passengers below in third class, who only had access to 1 bathtub for women and 1 for men, for all of the 709 passengers in third class. Can you imagine having to share 1 bathtub with hundreds of people for days? Worse yet, can you imagine being the crew member responsible for keeping those areas clean? Well, there was one thing that the third-class passengers had that the first and second-class passengers did not have. It's something that we might consider a convenience today, and that's automatically flushing toilets. Now, this wasn't because White Star Line wanted to do something special for its poorest customers. Their reasoning was that most third-class passengers did not have indoor plumbing at home and would either not have known or remembered to flush the toilets after using them. If Kate would have had to pay her own way to get on the Titanic, she surely would have been in third class. But she didn't. She was having a grand time with Henry, where as second-class passengers, they also would have had access to a smoking room, an enormous outdoor promenade, and a library where their afternoon tea and coffee were served. They also had a well-appointed dining room that could seat at least 2,400 people, and, to add to its upscale ambiance, a pianist would play to entertain the diners while they feasted on food that was often from the same menu as first-class passengers. In this day and age, it was normal on luxury ships for the first and second-class passengers to have a lavish 5-day party. On Titanic, they only had a 4-day party because, as we know, the voyage was cut short. Kate, as you recall, was described as a young woman who didn't have much of her own. So there's no doubt that her 4 days on the Titanic were the most lavish of her life. And Henry was so in love with her and would have had enough money to see to it that she had all of the proper dresses and outfits that Kate needed so that she could be a part of all of the festivities without missing a beat. Women spent months planning their wardrobes for trips like these. Traveling across the Atlantic on a luxury liner was a big deal, and it was an even bigger deal on the Titanic just because it was the Titanic. But you know how it is. Even these days when we go on an exciting vacation, many of us plan way ahead for what we want to wear. We think about the photos that we want to take and how the outfit will look at the whatever landmark. In 1912, those women shared that same kind of excitement, but there were more rules about what they had to wear on the ships and when. The first and second class ladies would change 4 times a day. For that reason, many of them would bring their maids. Off-the-rack clothing for women wouldn't be popular until another 15 to 20 years. Women were still wearing corsets and would have needed some help getting into those corsets. We know that Kate didn't have a maid, and Henry didn't hire one for the voyage, so I'm sure that it's a safe bet that Henry was helping Kate put her clothes on and take them off. For Kate and the rest of the ladies in second and first class, the first outfit of the day was a suit for breakfast. The second was a tea gown for afternoon tea. Then at night, there was a different evening dress for each day of the voyage. On April 14th, just a few hours before Titanic struck the iceberg, Kate would have slipped into one of her fine evening dresses and dined on some of these menu items from the second-class menu from that night that we happen to have here. Maybe she and Henry enjoyed some consommé tapioca, curried chicken and rice, pureed turnips, and coconut sandwiches for dessert. Titanic's second-class menus had some delicious options. And finally, after that filling, appetizing meal, a nightgown for retiring to bed would have been Kate's 4th change of the day as a lady in second class. And on April 14th, that would be Kate's final outfit change on her Titanic trip. But of course, she had no way of knowing that. Kate was floating on cloud 9. This man for whom she was working changed her life and her economic status by proposing marriage to her. He promised her a comfortable life in America, and she had every reason to believe that what he promised would come true, because so far it had. She saw all of the planning and scheming that Henry had done to make their dream become a reality. She was in on all of it. Their plan had to work, for if anyone back home in England found out what they were up to, both Henry and Kate would have to live the rest of their lives as scandals, social pariahs. It would have been even worse for Kate because a woman was supposed to be respectable. A man would have been given some grace because he was a man. Like, how could he resist the wiles of a 19-year-old vixen? But Henry and Kate's scheme stopped working as soon as the Titanic stopped floating. After 4 extravagant, fun-filled days, the ship that was called the Unsinkable would sink. On April 14th at 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg. Henry knew that it was something serious straight away. We know that many Titanic passengers felt that same shift in the boat and did not take it seriously or allow themselves to feel comfort in the assurance that they were on an unsinkable ship. Well, Henry did the opposite. He told Kate to wake up. She, as we know, was wearing only her nightgown. He also was wearing his night clothes. After she put slippers on her feet, he took her up to the boat deck to get her loaded onto a lifeboat. After striking the berg, Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews surveyed the damage and correctly predicted that the ship had only about 1 or 2 hours to float before sinking. Then it was midnight, April 15th. The crew members readied the lifeboats for launch. Just days before, the Unsinkable had made the news all over the world, with stories boasting about her maiden voyage. This was the ship that everyone wanted to get a ticket to board. But now, at midnight, the real prize was a way off of this boat. And with lifeboat space for only 1,178 of its 2,240 passengers, you can bet that a seat in the standard lifeboat was far more envied than a first-class cabin on the Ship of Dreams. Isn't that funny how quickly things can change in this life? Literally just minutes before Titanic was the ship that everyone wanted to be on. Just moments after midnight, only the lucky ones would be able to get off. Well, Henry's instincts were correct, as we know. The passengers had no way of knowing, but by 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith had ordered the Marconi operators to send out a distress signal. And though by the time that Titanic sailed, SOS had become the official distress signal, the operators sent both SOS and CQD calls. CQ signified a general call, and the D stood for distress. Many ships still used CQD, and the Titanic operators needed everyone on the receiving ends of their signals to understand that it was an emergency. They could not leave anything to chance. A number of vessels got the signal but were just too far away to respond. Then, at 12:20 a.m., the RMS Carpathia received from Titanic, "Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man." The Carpathia was a Cunard liner, and Cunard was White Star Line's biggest competitor at sea. Thankfully, none of that mattered when they received Titanic's distress signal. Carpathia's captain was Arthur Henry Rostron. Arthur and Henry, Kate's boss, and his brother's names. Anyway, he immediately changed the course of Carpathia to aid Titanic. It was 58 nautical miles away, too far to reach Titanic before she was predicted to sink. It would take Carpathia about 4 hours to reach the distressed ship. Titanic would be underwater by then, but some help was better than no help. Meanwhile, the first distress rocket was fired at 12:45 a.m. So, anyone who didn't know or didn't understand that the bump in the night that they felt was serious business now likely got the message. Passengers were starting to line up, waiting to enter lifeboats. They were entertained by Titanic's 8-man band, led by Wallace Hartley. The musicians were initially playing in the first-class lounge when the voyage was going as planned, but after Captain Smith issued orders to evacuate, the band moved out to the boat deck. And I said that the passengers were entertained by them, but it is more likely that the frantic passengers were calmed by the band. They played for those who were entering lifeboats and for the others who knew that their fate was to go down with the ship. None of the musicians would survive the sinking. Now, even though Henry and Kate were among the first to get to the boat deck, It appears that Kate was among the last to actually get into a lifeboat. Titanic historians, for the most part, agree that she got on lifeboat number 11, which launched from the starboard side at 1:45 a.m. A few sources say that she got on lifeboat number 13, but if the majority of the sources have it right, and she was on number 11, only one more lifeboat and 3 collapsibles would leave Titanic after this point. You might be wondering what took Kate so long to get on a lifeboat if she was, in fact, one of the first people lined up to get on one. The answer to that seems to be that Henry didn't want to let her go. It was after the trek from their cabin to the boat deck when Henry placed Kate's beautiful L'amour de la mer necklace on her neck one last time. Reportedly, he gave it to her on the first day of the voyage, and she wore it every night at dinner with one of her gowns. It was meant to be a precursor of even more stunning, expensive presents to come, just to show her a taste of what life was going to be like for her once they got settled in San Francisco, once Henry had his new candy shop up and running. But at this point, when it was clear to everyone the Titanic was going down, the beautiful necklace was looking more like a goodbye gift. After Henry placed the piece on Kate's neck, he clung tightly to her. He did not want to let her go. And if it had been up to him, he would not have let her go. But crew members grabbed Kate and threw her into a lifeboat. Henry had just enough time to steal a kiss. There was no time for long, sad goodbyes. People were scrambling for their lives. Now, Kate was safely floating away from Titanic in Lifeboat 11, wearing only her robe, slippers, and sapphire and diamond necklace, and holding a small sealskin purse. Kate was freezing, but she was safe. And that was more than could be said for Henry Morley. She didn't know it at that time, but that kiss that he gave her on the boat deck would be the last one that he would ever give her. Henry did not make his way into a lifeboat. Henry could not swim. He either drowned or froze to death in the icy waters of the Atlantic in the wee hours of April 15th, 1912. As Henry's lifeless body joined the other 1,500 fatalities, Kate remained afloat on Lifeboat 11, waiting to be rescued. The reality was that her lover, who was going to change her life, was gone forever. But what Kate didn't know at that time was that her love of the ocean necklace wasn't the only piece of Henry that was still with her. We'll get there. But first, we have to lay Henry to rest. It will be easy enough for us, but it was an emotionally difficult task for his family because his body, like so many other Titanic victims, was never recovered. Or if it was recovered, it was never identified and claimed by his family. Henry's death, while indeed sorrowful, was also a complication for the people he left behind. For starters, his brother Arthur had to come clean about knowing Henry's plan, but he only told as much as he needed to tell, as is evidenced by a small article in the Birmingham Post dated April 22nd, 1912. Here are the details that are laid out. Word reached Birmingham, England on April 20th that Henry was one of the victims of the Titanic disaster. His brother, Arthur, accompanied him to Southampton and watched him leave on the ship. And his brother really stuck to the script that Henry wrote before leaving. He told the paper that Henry left England to go to California in order to get well from a bout of sickness. Arthur also added that he had made a suggestion to his brother to take a German liner to Galveston, Texas, instead of taking the Titanic to New York. He said that he made this suggestion because he thought that a longer sea voyage might benefit his brother's health more. Now, we know that the Morley brothers were in on this plan together, and Henry wasn't leaving home because of his health, unless being sick of not having sex with a woman younger than your wife is a health risk. It might be. I'm not a doctor. But I wonder, if Arthur really did make this suggestion to Henry, Did he do it because there would have been an even smaller chance that he would bump into someone on the ship who knew him? That's my guess. What do you think about that? Anyway, the brief article also stated that Henry left behind a widow and one child. Now that's not a lie, but it's not the entire truth. Henry left behind a widow, a child, and a fiancé, and maybe more. Before we get back to that fiancé, I have to point out that on the same page as this article about Henry's death is what was said to be the official list of survivors. Now, this was only a week after the sinking, and it's very clear that this list is incomplete and incorrect. I can tell at a glance because Madeline Astor's name is not on it. But something else stands out to me. Mr. and Mrs. Marshall are listed as survivors. And so is Miss Katie Marshall, but Katie Phillips does not appear on this list. They booked their tickets as Mr. and Mrs. Marshall. So it appears that there's a chance that Henry's alias is shown to be a survivor on the same news page where his death is covered. Yes, Marshall is a common enough name, but Kate was booked as his wife, so she wouldn't have been Miss Marshall. But Kate and Katie are very similar names. It looks like there was definitely some confusion going on there. There was another small mix-up with Henry using the fake name of Mr. Marshall. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported it on April 20th, 1912, on what appears to be basically the sports page. At the time the Titanic sailed, the chess champion of the United States was Mr. Frank J. Marshall. He had been in Europe that spring. When his mother saw that there was a Mr. Marshall on the list of missing passengers, she panicked because she knew that her son was planning on returning home that same month, April. She just didn't know when. But chess lovers all around the world were able to take a sigh of relief. It was just Henry Marshall, not the famous chess player. Quick question that has absolutely nothing to do with the Titanic. How do you feel about chess being written about in the sports section? Is chess a sport? I mean, they show the spelling bee on ESPN. There are a few activities that blur the line between sport and skilled hobby, in my opinion. Race car driving, bowling, golf. Like, if you can do it really well and still not be an athlete, like if you can do it while drinking a beer and smoking a cigar, is it really a sport? Is it a sport if the person who's doing it is not an athlete? I'm curious to see your opinions. Golf is debatable, but chess is not a sport. I'm sorry. But back to Kate. To say that her scheme was not going as planned was an understatement. Here she was, 19 years old, stranded at sea in her nightgown, slippers, and a beautiful necklace. She and her fellow passengers were in Lifeboat 11 in the freezing air for hours. Thankfully for her, one of Titanic's crew members gave her his jacket for some warmth. She would have desperately needed it. The air temperature was just below 32 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of the collision. I can't imagine spending even 10 minutes in that kind of coldness in only my nightgown. At 3:30 a.m., the welcoming sounds and sights of Carpathia's rockets showed up to the area. I'm sure that Kate and her fellow Titanic survivors were relieved, but they weren't in the clear just yet. The first lifeboat to reach Carpathia was lifeboat number 2. That was at 4:10 a.m., and it would take several hours for Carpathia to pick up the rest of the survivors. On April 18th, the Carpathia arrived in New York, and even though it was late at night and raining, massive crowds were there waiting to greet the survivors. Carpathia carried 705 of Titanic's survivors to New York. Lifeboat space for less than half of them. And because of how sparingly those lifeboats were loaded, less than a third of them survived. And Kate was one of them, one of those survivors of the tragedy within a tragedy. She didn't know anything except that the life that she had planned with Henry went down with that ship, She thought that she would reach the shores of America and then her life would be set. If she knew one thing for certain about Henry, it's that he knew how to make a lot of money at his candy business. She was supposed to step off of the Titanic and have it made. Now, she didn't have a clue. Kate was in an extremely vulnerable position. She was taken in and cared for by the American Red Cross in New York City. After leaving the shelter of the Red Cross facilities, Kate was fortunate enough to meet a couple who took pity on her condition and took her into their home to care for her. And she needed the help. She was back down to nothing. Economically, the same position that she was in before she met Henry. Maybe a little worse. She left the Titanic with nothing more than her nightgown, slippers, and a jacket that belonged to someone else. But she also had that little sealskin purse. It contained the keys to her second-class cabin and the keys to her trunk that she packed for her voyage to America. At this point, 2 useless sets of keys. But that purse also contained the stunning sapphire and diamond necklace that Henry had given her. That necklace was starting to look more like something that she would have to pawn for money rather than something that she would get to enjoy for the rest of her life. She had fallen on hard times. But thankfully for Kate, a little bit of financial assistance was on the way thanks to a man named Ernest P. Bignell. In his capacity as director of the American Red Cross, he had set up the Titanic Relief Fund. It was just over $160,000 that he had raised to support Titanic widows and orphans. From this fund, Kate received some desperately needed clothing and $300. That $300 had the buying power of about $9,400 today in 2024, so it was a good amount of support for her situation. And soon, Kate was going to see just how much she really needed this money. You see, about 4 months after staying with the couple who took her in, Kate noticed that her clothes, even her new clothes, weren't fitting as well as they once had. It was as if they had shrunk in the clothing dryer. But it was 1912, and she didn't have a damn clothing dryer. People wouldn't really have those for another 50 years. I told you earlier that we would get back to that British newspaper that said that Henry left behind a wife and daughter. Well, it turned out that Henry had given Kate one more gift. He left behind 2 daughters, one with his wife and a very new one with Kate. Yes, Kate was pregnant. It is thought that Kate conceived on the Titanic. Luxury travel accommodations might make some women throw caution to the wind more so than a normal day at home, so I won't judge Kate. But the couple who took her in did judge her and told her that they did not feel comfortable with the idea of boarding a pregnant single woman. They told Kate that she had to leave. So you can see that that relief check came in right on time. Kate had to make new plans. She was only 19 years old. The only time that she had left home was to go away with Henry to America. Her only thought was to do what made sense to her, and that was to go back home to England. And she did. She made travel arrangements to return on another White Star liner, the Adriatic. Now, I gotta say, I do wonder why Henry didn't give Kate any money when he saw her off on the lifeboat. Maybe he thought that he would survive the disaster, or maybe he just didn't think about money in the middle of the panic. Either way, she really could have used that money that he took out of his bank before he got on the Titanic. Nevertheless, she was on her way back home, sailing back across the Atlantic. And by the way, I really applaud any Titanic survivor who could muster up the courage to get on another ship after living through that disaster. I frankly don't know how they were able to make it to New York on the Carpathia without needing to be sedated. But I do understand that Kate had to do what she needed to do in order to get home. But I am surprised that she, or any Titanic survivor, ever booked with White Star Line again. I would have at least wanted to cruise with Cunard, the company that rescued me. Nevertheless, That was Kate's decision. She was going back home on yet another White Star luxury liner. A quick bit of trivia about the Adriatic: it was the first ocean liner to feature a swimming pool. We can only imagine the emotions that Kate was experiencing on her journey home. If she ever had planned on returning home, it wasn't supposed to be like this, with no husband, no real future, and a baby in her belly. A married man's baby at that. She left London as a secret and returned as a scandal. Now, I'm jumping ahead of the story just a little here, but you already know that Kate had a child on the way, so I'm going to share with you what her daughter said about her mother returning home while she was pregnant with her daughter. Quote, "She was pregnant with a married man's child. If you were a single mother in those days, some people thought you were mentally retarded." End quote. Now, retarded isn't a word that we really use today, but people did think that something was wrong with Kate, and eventually, something was very wrong with the way that she was thinking and behaving. We'll get there. For now, we have to get Kate back home. She returned to her parents' small house in Worcester, visibly pregnant. She was unmarried and therefore a disgrace. This was 1912. And though seeing a single mother today is a fairly common occurrence, back then it wasn't. These days, many women choose to have a child without being married to the child's father. Sometimes it's not a choice for the mother, and some fathers do choose to walk away. Some women are artificially inseminated. But whatever the reasons may be, it's now fairly common to see single mothers. Kate was ahead of her time in the worst way, though. It was bad enough that she was an unwed mother. But to add to her shame, her child's father had been a married man. The story eventually got out around town that Kate had eloped with Henry Morley and was pregnant with his child. Then, exactly 9 months after Kate and Henry boarded the Titanic, a baby girl was born in Kate's parents' home, the same one listed on the 1911 census when she started working for Henry. On January 11th, 1913. Kate named her Ellen Mary Phillips because she did not have the legal right to name her Ellen Mary Morley. In Ellen's own words, "It was a disgrace to be born without a father." Here she was, an object of shame, and she hadn't done anything but be born. And Kate balled up all of her grief, shame, and longing for the future that should have been with the love of her life, Henry, and took it out on that innocent baby girl and became the worst mother imaginable. There were two good things that Kate did for her daughter, though one of them didn't really amount to anything and it turned into something negative. That was that Kate fought to have Henry Morley recognized as her daughter's father. She wanted his name on her daughter's birth certificate. That would have legitimized baby Ellen and possibly entitled the child to some of the money that her father left behind. But the fulfillment of this request would never come to fruition during Kate's lifetime, leaving Ellen to keep the fight going throughout her entire adult life. For Kate, even bringing up this argument was a negative because it left a blemish on her own character. Whether anyone wanted to believe her or not, the fact was that by insisting that Henry was baby Ellen's father, Kate was also admitting that she had had a sexual affair with a married man, a man who everyone knew she knew was married. So you can imagine that people were talking around town. Was this little girl Henry's baby? Was Kate telling the truth? How could anyone trust a harlot who admitted to sleeping with her married boss? Kate started the campaign to have Henry's name placed on her baby's birth certificate as soon as she got home. As she was marching on with her fight, Henry's family had their own pressing matter to deal with, Henry's will. If Kate could have gotten just someone to choose her side, she could have some money set aside for her daughter before she was born. Good old brother Arthur was the executor of what was left of Henry's fortune. It was 1,136 pounds, According to the CPI inflation calculator for the UK, that's a little over £160,000 today. That's roughly 200,000 USD for my fellow Americans. Definitely not enough money to live on without having to work, especially when we take into consideration that that amount was divided amongst Henry's creditors and family members. But even a fraction of the estate would have been a help to Kate. And, after all of the math was done, at the end of September in 1912, just months before Kate was due to deliver the baby, Arthur came up with a nice round figure to give Kate from the will. 0. It doesn't get any rounder than that. We know that Kate was only trying to do what was best for her daughter, and if we're being honest, she was trying to make her own life a little easier too by lightening her financial load. But that just didn't work out. She was starting to learn just how tough life was going to be as a single mother in 1912. People talked, and nobody had anything good to say about a young, sneaky husband stealer. Henry and Kate, with their narrow-minded decision-making, had created some difficult pathways forward for everyone to navigate. How do you think you would have handled this situation if you were one of Henry's close family members and Kate needed your help? If Kate had come to you and said, "I'm sorry for trying to run off to America with Henry, but will you please allow me to put his name on my daughter's birth certificate and give me some money?" Do you think that you would have told her yes if you were Henry's brother? What if you were Henry's wife? I mean, she had to have known the truth. They all knew. One Wednesday morning, neither one of them shows up at work. Or ever again. If Henry was ready to run off and marry Kate and leave home in such a sloppy way, he was likely talking about her way too much to his family and friends. Way more than he did about his other employees. Can you picture him telling his wife things like, "Kate's so young and already so smart at, candy. I can't wait to see her at work tomorrow, babe." Anyway, the other good deed that Kate performed on the behalf of her daughter was more beneficial. Even though it may sound cruel, and Kate's intentions behind it didn't necessarily have her daughter at the forefront of her mind, and that is that she left her daughter behind shortly after giving birth to her. Kate left baby Ellen to be reared by Kate's mother and father. While it's sad to think of a child not having the love of her mother, Kate's parents' house was the best place that Ellen could have been. And for a little more than the first decade of her life, that's where she was. Ellen thought that her grandparents were her mother and father, because Kate would only come to visit the child occasionally, but Ellen never knew that Kate was her mother. Thankfully for Ellen, her grandparents doted on her and she grew up in a loving environment. And Ellen loved her grandparents. Her grandfather, Kate's father, was still working at a job that brought in a decent wage, and Ellen's grandmother, Kate's mother, stayed at home. She made Ellen's dresses, which Ellen thought were beautiful, and Ellen's grandparents sent her to a private convent school. By the way, it was Henry's brother, Arthur, who paid for Ellen's education. This was 100% an acknowledgement that Henry was Ellen's father. The Morley family could never publicly admit it, but they definitely knew the truth. Reportedly, Ellen looked a lot like Henry, so much that it probably seemed silly to deny their relation. But the young Ellen didn't know anything about that paternity mess. Ellen called her grandparents Mum and Dad. As far as she knew, they were her parents. Kate left Ellen with her parents so that she could go off and start a new life for herself in London. But sometimes she would drop in and visit her daughter. Here's how those visits went, according to Kate's daughter, Ellen. Quote, "Sometimes she would come for a visit, but of course I didn't know who she was. She would sweep in, hug me tightly, make a fuss of me, then leave again. For some reason, I didn't like it and dreaded her visits. It wasn't until much later that I found out who she really was." End quote. Ellen's days with her grandparents were filled with love and laughter. They had a family punt. That's a long, narrow, flat-bottomed boat that's square at both ends and propelled with a long pole, kind of like a canoe. Some days they would take the punt out on the river. There was a special seat for Ellen, in which her grandparents would strap her really tight. Her grandfather would always say, while they were out enjoying their river outings, quote, "We'll make sure you don't drown," end quote. It was a joke that Ellen didn't understand. She wouldn't understand what it meant until she was a teenager. Apparently, whatever plans Kate had made for herself in London were not working for her. She wasn't able to make the money that she needed to provide for herself, let alone a child. Then, in walked Arthur Morley back into Kate's life. He was Ellen's uncle, though he would never say it publicly. He stepped up to offer Kate a little financial help, on the condition that she took her daughter into her own care. The money was to help Ellen. It only went into Kate's hands because she was her mother. It was Arthur's way of offering child support to aid his niece. The deal that Arthur extended to Kate was that if she took custody of her daughter, he would pay her £1 per week. Kate needed the money desperately, so she went to her parents and collected her child. As Ellen saw it, quote, "She took me away from my grandparents when I was 12. It was a dreadful experience," end quote. Now, this is just an observation, but 12 was also the age of Henry's daughter with his wife when Kate took him away from his family. And I'm just saying took him away as an expression. I 100% understand that Henry was a grown man and Kate did not make him do anything that he didn't want to do. But still, it's sad that both of his daughters experienced trauma surrounding their change of parental circumstances at the same age of 12. The day that Kate took custody of Ellen, Ellen's life was changed, and not for the better. She said that her mother was always cruel to her, and she remembered the nasty words that came out of Kate's mouth as soon as they left her grandparents' house. They were, "You're no longer a lady now, madam." My goodness. The sweet life that Ellen had known with her grandparents all of a sudden came to a screeching halt as soon as Kate got her hands on her daughter. According to Ellen, Kate had nothing but scorn and bitterness to give her. She never had one kind word to say to her daughter. The beautiful clothes that Ellen's grandmother had made for her, Kate replaced them with coarse black stockings and boots. She would often hit Ellen, beating her legs with a stick. And this punishment would last for days at a time and was probably the most disgusting thing that I read about what Kate would do to Ellen. I want you to hear it in Ellen's words. Quote, "Sometimes she would lock me up in a cupboard for days with just a pot in there to use as a toilet." End quote. Can you imagine your own mother doing this to you? Beating you and leaving you in the dark for days with nothing but a pot to use for you to relieve yourself? Disgusting. And a lot of those punishments were handed down to Ellen for simply looking like her father. That's what she had done wrong. Just existed and looked like the man who helped to create her. For years, Ellen's days were filled with misery, compliments of her mother. Now, I'm going to add some more quotes from Ellen as we go on with this story, but I want to make it clear to you that I have been doing that earlier in this story before I let you know that she was born. I love you as viewers and listeners of my content, and I know that some of you do your own research, buy the books that are listed in my sources, and even pause the screen to read the articles that I display in my videos. That being said, there are times when most sources revealed a detail contrary to what Ellen said. In those moments, I have deferred to Ellen's recollection since she would have heard the story firsthand from her mother. But I will let you know what the other sources say so that you can decide for yourself or do your own research to draw your own conclusion. So far, there have been minor details that don't affect the course of this story. For instance, some sources say that Kate returned to England on the Celtic,
but Ellen said that it was the Adriatic, so I went with that. I just trust that she remembered what her mother told her, and she would have no motive to change the story. I also got from Ellen the detail regarding why it took so long for Kate to get on a lifeboat, being because, as she retold it, that Henry clung to her and refused to let her go. But back to Kate and Ellen. Kate's relatives and friends said that she was never the same after returning home from the disaster. And I don't think that we would expect any person who survived Titanic to be the same person that they were before such a horror. But that didn't excuse Kate's abuse of her daughter. After Kate had given up on the fight to have Ellen legally recognized as Henry's child, she rarely spoke of him. That's understandable. I'm sure that thoughts of him were a source of pain for her. But what is not understandable or justified in any way is the pain that she caused her child just because Henry was gone. It wasn't Ellen's fault. Kate treated her daughter like she was a servant, or even worse, a slave. Ellen's teenage years were filled with orders and beatings from her mother, and Kate only told Ellen about her father during a fit of rage after Ellen raised her voice to her mother after being fed up with her demands. Here's how that happened. Kate actually found a man who wanted to marry her. When she moved to London to find work, she got a job as a saleswoman, selling shoes and hats. That was when she met Frederick Watson. He owned a window cleaning business. Here is where I have to admit that I'm confused on the timeline because Ellen doesn't provide one. It's clear from Ellen's account that Frederick Watson witnessed the abuse that Kate inflicted upon Ellen. In her story, Frederick later opens a cafe, and she, Ellen, works for him there. Ellen's version makes it seem as if Frederick married her mother after Kate took custody of her. But according to Encyclopedia Titanica, Frederick married Kate in 1918, and then Kate took custody of Ellen 4 years later. And that same source also says that Frederick and Kate had their own daughter before Ellen was added to their family. Again, I'm letting you know what the other sources say, but for the sake of our story, I will defer to Ellen's story. Some details in Ellen's story just don't fit in with what the other sources say. Ellen refers to her stepfather as a kind man, so I don't think that he would have stood by and watched her be abused for several years. By the timeline of other sources, he would have. And it doesn't make sense to me that if Kate was married to a business owner, that she would have needed money from Arthur in exchange for taking care of her own daughter. So I'm just going to go back to Ellen's story, and I hope that you understand why. It simply makes more sense, even though the timeline is incomplete. So, back to Frederick's cafe. There were living quarters above the cafe where Frederick, Kate, and Ellen lived. Whenever Kate needed something, she would bang on the floor, which was the ceiling of the cafe. That was Ellen's signal that her mother needed something, and Ellen needed to quickly see how she could serve her mother. Ellen hated it, especially on the days that the cafe was really busy with customers. Well, on one busy day, she just couldn't take it anymore. Kate started beating on the floor to get Ellen's attention, and Ellen stormed up to Kate's room. According to Ellen, this is what happened, quote, "I said, 'Why don't you just put your head under the covers and die?' She looked at me in terror and said, 'Don't look at me that way. That's how your father looked at me the night he said goodbye to me on the Titanic.' That was the first real information I ever had about him. Up until then, I hardly knew a thing." End quote. So that is how Ellen learned about her father. But thankfully for her, she had a stepfather who cared for her. He did not approve of the way that Ellen abused Kate, so he did something about it. He reported Kate's physical and mental abuse of Ellen to legal authorities. His report prompted an investigation into Kate. The findings eventually led to a court order being filed against Kate, his own wife, to stop abusing her daughter. Ellen said that Frederick was a wonderful man who saved her life because of the way he stepped in on her behalf. After that court ruling, Kate gave up on life. It was as if abusing her daughter was the only thing that she lived for. Shortly after being ordered to not physically abuse her daughter, Kate took to her bed and never got out of it again. Frederick took all that he could from Kate before he finally got fed up and eventually abandoned her. This was around the time that a 16-year-old Ellen received the Love of the Ocean necklace from her mother. This is how she recalled it, quote, "When I was 16, my mother gave me a diamond and sapphire necklace and a sealskin purse with 2 keys inside. She simply gave them to me with the words, 'Here, take these, they're yours now,'" end quote. After that, Kate's mental condition continued to worsen. It got so bad that she even attempted ending her own life on multiple occasions. The method of one of her attempts was swallowing acid. She survived, but to no one's surprise, the acid burned the walls of her stomach. After Frederick left Kate, Ellen was practically an adult and able to run her own life. She made the decision for herself and her mental and physical health to move away from Kate. What poetic irony that Kate, who was perfectly comfortable with the man of her dreams, abandoning his wife and daughter to be with her, would spend the rest of her life abandoned by her own husband and daughter. And poor Ellen, she continued the fight that her mother had started before she was born, the fight to have Henry Morley's name put on her birth certificate. Ellen never stopped fighting to be recognized as Henry's daughter. But she didn't let that battle overshadow her entire life. She lived a little. She found a new job working as a florist. Later, she moved on from that position and worked for the London Passport Office. And Ellen got married. In 1935, when she was 22, she married a teacher named Lawrence Farmer. Later that same year, they had a son together. His name was Robert. Well, a few years after this little family got its start, they would be broken up because World War II started and Lawrence had to go away to serve his country and fight. This is where Ellen allowed her mother's bad example to guide her life. She shamefully had a sexual affair while Lawrence was on the front lines in the trenches fighting for king and country. That's right. Before her husband came home, Ellen was in bed with a new man, a bus driver named Frederick Walker. Well, of course Lawrence didn't want for his son to be reared by this other man and, in his mind now, his whorish wife. So he took Ellen to court for custody of little Robert. And Lawrence won. After gaining custody of his son, Lawrence sued Ellen for divorce, and he won his divorce as well. Maybe that made Ellen feel like a winner, because after getting divorced, she did what she wanted to do anyway. And what she wanted to do was marry Frederick, and she did in 1944. Now here she was, kind of following her mother's footsteps, having an affair and losing custody of her child. Speaking of her mother, Kate, with no one left to care for her, was put into an insane asylum, and that is where her story ended. Most sources say that Kate's final ending came in 1964, but Ellen says that her mother died in 1958, alone in the asylum. By that time, Ellen had been apart from her mother for years and only saw Kate's death as a blessing. She didn't even know when it happened exactly. She was told months later by an aunt. Ellen turned out to be a lot more like her mother than she'd ever hoped to. As an adult, she never forgave her mother, but she understood her. Kate abused Ellen because, in Ellen's words, she was the embodiment of Kate's troubles, and Kate just couldn't get over it. Fast forward to 1989. Ellen was still fighting to have Henry's name put on her birth certificate. By this time, she was 76 years old. She got a special treat that year. It wasn't the treat for which she had been fighting for decades, but it was something that was almost just as sweet. Mike Grundy, who was a columnist for the Worcester News, had run a story about 3 men who died on the Titanic. One of those men was Ellen's father, Henry. And Mike Grundy presented to Ellen the photograph of Henry that he was going to use in his story. In his words, "When I handed her a photo of her father, she cried." That was Ellen's first time seeing her father's face in a clear photo. The following decade was not kind to Ellen at all. In the 1990s, she was living in Perthshire and had become an elderly woman who had fallen on hard times financially. In a moment of desperation, she did something that she never thought she would have to do. For most of her life, she had in her possession that same little sealskin purse that Kate had when she left the Titanic. In that purse had always been the keys to her parents' cabin and Kate's sapphire and diamond necklace. The content of that purse went from being a family heirloom to fast cash in an instant when Ellen found a buyer, a Southampton dealer who was delighted to get some Titanic relics. According to Ellen's granddaughter, Ellen was paid only £450, about $560, for all of those items, necklace included. And that's just a little more than $1,000 today. The piece was easily worth a 5-figure amount. That should tell us just how desperate she was to get her hands on some money. Ellen remained in Perthshire until her death on October 29, 2005. She was 92 years old, and in those 92 years, the question of her paternity was never definitively or publicly resolved. I'm sure that Ellen would have found bittersweetness in the revelation that DNA testing proved her right in December of the year 2020. It was then that DNA comparisons of members of the Phillips and Morley families conclusively established that Henry Morley was the father of Ellen Mary Phillips, 15 years after her death. Ellen was certainly no saint, but I do find it sad that for her own sake, she never got the proof of paternity that she had sought her whole life. This, in and of itself, is confirmation for me that though Ellen Mary was not yet born when the ship and her father slipped under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean that early morning, that she was still in every way a survivor of the Titanic disaster. As for the other people left behind in the wreckage of the Henry and Kate affair, they remained faithful to their partners. Henry's abandoned wife turned widow, Louisa, never remarried. She died on September 1st, 1930. And the daughter Henry deserted, Doris, went on to marry a man of the cloth, Reverend Arthur Sidwell Johnson. Doris was his wife until he died in 1992. She lived to be 100, dying in Warwickshire in 2000. Kate's great-granddaughter, Beverly Farmer, now owns the sealskin purse that once contained the Love of the Sea necklace and Titanic cabin keys. She has kept the story of Kate and Henry alive for the sake of her family's history. The necklace is still likely in the possession of the dealer who purchased it in the 1990s. So, what many of us may have thought was a completely fictional component of James Cameron's Titanic was based on the sad love story of Kate Phillips and Henry Morley. And the moral of their story is mainly for the fellas, and it is, don't abandon your wife and sneak out of your country with a young harlot. If you do, you'll die. The heart of the ocean being thrown into the Atlantic Ocean in the movie was fake. However, a real Titanic passenger did throw an expensive piece of jewelry into a body of water, but she did it years after the Titanic disaster. She was Madeline Astor, the wife of Titanic's richest passenger, John Jacob Astor, who bravely died in the sinking. And when she was on her husband number 3, she threw a very expensive piece of jewelry in a lake as a sign of affection. to prove to her much younger husband that she loved him. That wasn't the only thing that she did that was foolish during the course of that relationship. I published a video about their insane saga of a marriage that was abusive and downright ridiculous. You can see it here. I'll also leave links to it in the description box and in the pinned comment for this video. My sources for this story are the Gloucestershire Echo Archives, 1909. Titanic Children, Eyewitnesses to History, edited by Anthony Cunningham. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives, 1912. Britannica.com. The Birmingham Post Archives, 1912. EncyclopediaTitanica.org. The Essex Newsman Herald Archives, 1912. ExploreThePast.co.uk. Sunday Dispatch Archives, 1912. Soliloquism.com. Birmingham Evening Mail Archives, 1917. Washington Times Archives, 2012. And the Rock Island Argus Archives, 2016. The Evening World News Archives, 1907. The Morning Post Archives, 1907. The Chattanooga Star Archives, 1907. The New York Tribune Archives, 1910. The Buffalo News Archives, 1912. Newark Star Eagle Archives, 1912. The Wall Street Journal Archives, 1912 and 1913. The Sun Archives, 1913. The Sunday People Archives, 1998. The New York Times Archives, 1894. Jenny.com. Encyclopedia Titanica. Press and Sun Bulletin Archives, 1912. The Buffalo News Archives, 1912. Shadow of the Titanic, The Extraordinary Stories of Those Who Survived by Andrew Wilson. The Post Star Archives, 1912. The Buffalo Times Archives, 1912 and 1919. Buffalo Courier Archives, 1912 and 1913. The New York Times Archives, 1913. The Baltimore Sun Archives, 1913. The Pittsburgh Press Archives, 1919. The New York Tribune Archives, 1919 and 1920. And the Courier Archives, 1946. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the Hot Mess History. The link is in the description box.